Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Ghost in the Square. Have you ever wondered what lurks beneath your feet? What hidden things wait in the shadows, forgotten by the world above? I hadn't. Not until the first night I heard it, the soft, scraping noise, as though something was moving through the darkness far below the city. It started out as nothing more than a whisper in the underground tunnels where I worked. I was a construction supervisor in New York City, overseeing the repairs to the subway system. For years, I had become accustomed to the noises of the old tunnels, the echoes of the train wheels, the distant rattle of pipes, the creaks of aging steel. But there was something different about this sound. It wasn't the usual hum of machinery or the distant murmur of water seeping through cracks. It was something alive. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just the wind. After all, these tunnels are old, some parts have been abandoned for decades. But when the noise continued, persistent and rhythmic, my nerves began to tighten. It sounded like claws scrabbling against concrete. My heart thumped as I turned my flashlight toward the source of the sound, half expecting to see a rat or some other small animal. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of electricity and the silence that filled the air. That night, as I prepared to leave the site, I caught something strange. A flicker of movement just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I quickly turned, but again, nothing. Just shadows. My mind tried to rationalize it, probably just a trick of the light or a rat skittering across the tracks. But the feeling of unease lingered. The next night, the sounds came again, louder this time. I was standing in the maintenance tunnel, just near the junction where the old trains once ran, when I heard them scratching, moving, skittering. And then, something different. Something deeper. The unmistakable sound of something large, something heavy moving in the dark. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a rat. I called for my team, but they hadn't heard anything. They joked, calling me paranoid, and I laughed it off too. We were in the deepest parts of the tunnels, after all, where the noise was often unpredictable. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us. And then it happened again. One of the workers, Frank, had been in a side tunnel when we all heard it at once. This time, it wasn't just scratching. It was a thudding, a heavy thumping, like something huge was moving through the walls, pushing its way down the narrow passage. Frank's flashlight flickered, and he swore. The rest of us rushed toward him, but by the time we arrived, Frank was gone. At first, I thought he had just run off, spooked by something. But then we saw it, the deep claw marks, long and jagged, carved into the walls of the tunnel. And then we found the trail of deep, bloody prints that led away into the darkness. Whatever had taken Frank, it wasn't human. I thought back to the sounds. The shadows. The way they had felt like something was watching us. But that was impossible, right? There were no such things as ghosts or monsters, just rats. Just some wild animals scurrying through the old pipes and tunnels. Nothing to worry about, nothing to fear. But as I stood in the tunnel, the air growing thick with an unnatural chill, I began to realize that I had been wrong. Something was down here. Something older than the city itself, something that had been waiting. And it was coming closer. The air began to shift, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned around, half expecting to see Frank standing there, his face twisted in fear, but there was only the growing darkness. I heard it again. The unmistakable scratching. This time, it was closer. And then, silence. For the first time since we entered the tunnels, I felt it, the deep, suffocating silence. No hum of the trains, no creak of the pipes. Just waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe this was just exhaustion, or maybe Frank had gone further down the tunnel to look for a way out. I was about to call it his name when I saw it. A shadow, moving unnaturally fast, darting across the far end of the tunnel. I barely had time to react before the eyes appeared. Hundreds of them, glowing in the darkness. They blinked, moved, watching. And then, from the pitch black of the tunnel, something stepped forward. It was tall, taller than any man, and its outline twisted, like something not meant to be seen. It had legs, long and spindly, like some kind of giant insect. And in the center of the mass of legs and shadows, glowing in the dim light, were its eyes, red, gleaming, as if they were the last thing you would ever see. I couldn't breathe. The shadow took another step forward, and I heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws on concrete. They were coming. And I wasn't ready. Not for this. Not for whatever this thing was. As I turned to run, I heard the footsteps behind me. They were closing in. I was trapped. I ran, my breath ragged, the sound of my boots echoing off the concrete walls. The tunnels stretched endlessly before me, their oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Behind me, the footsteps, no, the thundering of claws, grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. Whatever was chasing me, it wasn't something I wanted to see again. My flashlight beam jittered wildly as I sprinted, the cone of light illuminating little more than fleeting glimpses of rusted pipes and crumbling brick. The air was damp, thick with the metallic tang of decay. Ahead, the tunnel forked. Left or right? My mind raced, paralyzed by indecision. Behind me, a sound split the air, a guttural screech, raw and alien, reverberating through the tunnels. It was close. Too close. I bolted left without thinking, praying the path wouldn't dead end. The tunnel narrowed, forcing me to duck beneath low-hanging pipes. My shoulder clipped a valve, sending a metallic clang echoing through the dark. I winced. The noise felt like a beacon, announcing my location to whatever was pursuing me. My thoughts spiraled, fragmented by panic. What was that thing? Where did it come from? Was this what took Frank? His face flashed in my mind, gruff, always joking, always steady. Now he was gone, snatched into the shadows. And I was next. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, a maintenance room long forgotten. Rusted tools hung limply on the walls, their outlines barely visible in the faint glow of my flashlight. Puddles of stagnant water pooled on the floor, their surfaces rippling with unseen movement. I stopped to catch my breath, pressing myself against the cold concrete wall. My chest heaved, each gulp of air burning my throat. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I dared to hope I'd lost it. Then, the scratching began again. Soft at first, almost gentle, like nails lightly grazing a chalkboard. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the chamber. My flashlight wavered as my hands trembled. I swung the beam wildly, searching for the source. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The sound felt small, swallowed by the vastness of the underground. No answer. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was joined by another sound, wet, slithering, as though something massive was dragging itself through the muck. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls. And then I saw it. The eyes. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, glowing red and staring from the darkness. They blinked in unison, a grotesque choreography that made my stomach churn. The creature stepped into the light, its form more terrible than I had imagined. It wasn't just one being, it was many. Its body writhed and shifted, composed of smaller creatures fused together in a nightmarish mass. Rats. Hundreds of them, their bodies twisted and malformed, moving as one horrific entity. Their teeth glistened, sharp and wet, and their collective hiss filled the chamber. I froze, my mind unable to process the grotesque sight before me. The creature's many heads turned toward me, their beady eyes narrowing. It took a step forward, its clawed feet scraping against the floor. My legs refused to move. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by a primal fear. Then the smell hit me. A rancid, putrid stench that made my stomach heave. It was decay, death, and something worse, something ancient, as though this thing had crawled from the depths of a forgotten hell. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. It hit the floor with a dull clatter, its beam spinning wildly. In the chaos of shadows, the creature lunged. Adrenaline surged, and I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its swipe. Its claws raked the wall where I'd been standing, leaving deep gouges in the concrete. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a rusted pipe from the floor. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the pipe in front of me. The creature paused, its heads tilting in eerie unison, as though studying me. For a moment, I thought it might retreat. Then it surged forward, a mass of writhing bodies and gnashing teeth. I swung the pipe with all my strength, connecting with one of its heads. The impact sent a sickening crack through the air, and the creature recoiled, screeching in pain. But it didn't stop. The injured head fell away, and another emerged from its place, snapping its jaws hungrily. I turned and ran, my mind screaming at my legs to move faster. The creature's hisses filled the tunnel behind me, joined by the wet slap of its many feet against the ground. It was gaining on me. Up ahead, I saw a glimmer of light, an access ladder leading to a service hatch. Salvation. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. Reaching the ladder, I leapt, gripping the cold metal rungs. The creature lunged, its claws swiping at my legs. I screamed as one claw grazed my ankle, tearing through my boot. Pain shot up my leg, but I forced myself to climb. Hand over hand, I ascended, the creature snapping at my heels. Its claws clanged against the metal ladder, and I felt its rancid breath on my back. The hatch was sealed. "No, no, no!" I yelled, slamming my fists against it. My fingers scrabbled for the release latch, my vision blurring with tears. The creature roared below, its massive body shaking the ladder. With a final desperate push, the hatch creaked open, and I hauled myself through. I slammed it shut just as the creature's claws reached the opening. Its enraged screeches echoed through the metal, shaking the hatch beneath me. I lay on the ground, gasping for air. The city lights glimmered above, oblivious to the nightmare below. But I knew it wasn't over. I sat on the edge of the manhole, clutching my ankle, the sharp sting of the wound making my whole leg tremble. Blood soaked through the torn leather of my boot, dripping onto the pavement. Around me, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, distant voices called out, and the glow of neon signs flickered across rain-slicked streets. But I couldn't move. My breathing was shallow, my body frozen in a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. What was that thing? My mind replayed the scene over and over, the glowing eyes, the writhing bodies, the smell. My stomach churned, and I barely managed to keep from vomiting. A man walking his dog passed by, throwing me a curious glance. I wanted to call out, to tell him to run, to stay away from the tunnels. But no words came. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? "Hey, you okay?" a voice startled me. I looked up to see a sanitation worker leaning out of his truck, his face lined with concern. Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to stand. Pain shot through my leg, and I winced, gripping the edge of the truck for support. "Looks like you've been through something," he said, eyeing my bloodied boot. "You sure you don't need help?" "I'm fine," I insisted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Thanks." He shrugged and drove off, leaving me alone under the cold glow of a street lamp. I needed answers. Whatever was down there, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't staying hidden anymore. I had to find out more about the tunnels, about Frank, about the thing that nearly killed me. Back at my apartment, I locked the door behind me and shoved a chair under the knob. It was an old habit, something I hadn't done since I moved to the city. But now, every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street made my heart race. I sank into my chair, pulling out my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. Where do I even start? I typed disappearances in NYC tunnels into the search bar. Articles flooded the screen, most of them vague and unhelpful. Missing workers, abandoned projects, strange sounds reported by maintenance crews. Nothing concrete, just rumors and speculation. Then one headline caught my eye. "The Forgotten Tunnels, a hidden network beneath the city." I clicked the link. The article detailed a labyrinth of abandoned subway lines, maintenance shafts, and forgotten passageways stretching beneath New York. Some had been sealed off for decades, others repurposed or lost to time. But there were stories of workers who ventured too deep, of sounds and shadows that couldn't be explained. One paragraph sent chills down my spine. In the 1940s, a series of disappearances among maintenance crews led to an investigation that was quietly shut down. Reports spoke of large, aggressive rodents deep in the tunnels, but no evidence was ever found. Locals began to whisper about creatures that had adapted to life in the dark, growing larger and more dangerous over time. I leaned back, my mind racing. Was this what I saw? Could something have survived down there, evolving in the shadows? The sound of scratching snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze, my heart pounding. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the vent near the floor. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench I kept for repairs, and crept toward the vent. The scratching grew louder as I approached, steady and deliberate. I knelt down, my breath shallow, and shone my phone's flashlight into the grate. Two red eyes stared back. I stumbled backward, dropping the phone. The light skittered across the room, plunging the vent into shadow. The scratching turned into a screech, and I heard the metal of the vent cover groan as something pressed against it. "No," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. I grabbed the phone and the wrench, backing away toward the door. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body was frozen. The vent cover burst off, clattering to the floor. A massive rat, its body twisted and grotesque, crawled out. Its fur was matted, its teeth yellow and jagged. But it wasn't alone. More followed, spilling into the room, their eyes glowing like tiny embers. I swung the wrench, connecting with one of them. It let out a high-pitched squeal, but the others kept coming, undeterred. They moved as one, their movements too synchronized, too deliberate. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock and throwing it open. I didn't stop to grab anything. My apartment was no longer safe. The rats were spilling into the hallway now, their claws clicking against the floor. I ran into the night, the cold air biting at my face. Behind me, I could hear them scratching, screeching, relentless. And I knew. They weren't just in the tunnels anymore. The streets were empty at this hour, the usual hum of the city replaced by an eerie stillness. I limped down the sidewalk, my injured ankle throbbing with each step. Behind me, the screeches and scratching echoed faintly, growing fainter as I moved further away. But I knew they weren't gone. They were just waiting. I ducked into a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent lights almost too bright after the darkness. A few patrons sat at the counter, their faces tired and indifferent. The smell of burnt coffee and fried food hung heavy in the air. It felt normal, safe, even. Sliding into a booth at the back, I let out a shaky breath and tried to collect my thoughts. I couldn't go back to my apartment, not with those things crawling through the walls. But where could I go? How do you outrun something that's always been here, hidden beneath your feet? The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, approached. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing my disheveled appearance. "You could say that," I muttered. "Coffee, please." "Black." She nodded and shuffled off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed a message to Frank. "You were right. They're real. Call me." I hit send and stared at the screen, willing it to light up with a response. But it stayed dark. Frank hadn't answered since his cryptic warning earlier, and now I feared the worst. The coffee arrived, steaming and bitter. I took a sip, the warmth doing little to calm the chill in my chest. My mind wandered to the tunnels again, to the glowing eyes and the writhing mass of fur and teeth. These weren't just oversized rats. They were something else, something that didn't belong in the light. The door jingled as it opened, and I glanced up instinctively. A man in a rumpled suit walked in, his face pale and drawn. He looked around nervously before sitting a few booths away, his back to the wall. His eyes darted around the room, and for a moment they met mine. There was something in his expression, fear, recognition. Before I could say anything, he leaned over and whispered to the waitress. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone. His hands shook as he pulled out a small notebook and began scribbling furiously, glancing at the door every few seconds. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something. I stood, clutching my coffee, and limped over to his booth. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, startled. I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," I insisted. "I think we're dealing with the same thing." His eyes widened, and he gestured for me to sit. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he whispered. I nodded. "In the tunnels. And now, they're in the city." He let out a shaky breath. I've been tracking them for years. Ever since I lost my brother down there. He tapped the notebook. They're not just animals. There's something older, something that's been hiding beneath us for centuries. Where are they? I asked, leaning in. He hesitated, his eyes darting around the diner. Survivors. They adapted to the dark, to the filth. But they're smart, smarter than we give them credit for. And they're organized. Organized? My stomach sank. Ow! They communicate, he said, his voice barely audible. Through sounds, vibrations. They hunt together, like a pack. And now, he paused, his face grim. Now they're coming to the surface. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs wavered, and the room seemed to grow colder. The waitress emerged from the kitchen, her face pale. Power outage, someone muttered from the counter. But I knew better. The man across from me froze, his eyes locked on the window. They're here, he whispered. I turned, my heart pounding. Outside, the street was empty, but the shadows seemed wrong. They moved when they shouldn't, stretching and twisting like living things. A faint scratching sound reached my ears, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The other patrons noticed it too, their faces twisting in confusion and fear. What the hell is that? Someone yelled. The man grabbed my arm. We have to leave. Now. But it was too late. The windows shattered as a swarm of creatures burst through, their glowing eyes and jagged teeth filling the room. Screams erupted as the patrons tried to flee, but the rats were too fast, too relentless. I grabbed the man's arm and pulled him toward the kitchen, hoping for an exit. The waitress was already there, fumbling with a back door that wouldn't budge. It's stuck, she cried, tears streaming down her face. The scratching grew louder, and I turned to see the swarm closing in, their eyes burning like tiny embers in the darkness. This way, the man shouted, pointing to a ventilation shaft. It was small, barely big enough to crawl through, but it was our only chance. We scrambled inside, the metal walls cold and slick with grease. Behind us, the rats clawed at the opening, their screeches echoing in the confined space. Keep moving, the man urged, his voice strained. The shaft led us into another part of the building, a maintenance room filled with pipes and machinery. We slammed the vent shut behind us, barricading it with whatever we could find. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the scratching. They won't stop, the man said, his voice trembling. Not until they've taken everything. And deep down, I knew he was right. The scratching on the vent grew louder, more desperate. The creatures were relentless, their claws scraping against the thin metal like nails on a chalkboard. The man, the one who claimed to know about them, paced frantically, muttering under his breath as he flipped through his notebook. They're not just hunting, he said, his voice tight. They're pushing us, driving us somewhere. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the barricade, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. A way to survive. The maintenance room was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead casting long shadows. Pipes snaked along the walls, dripping condensation onto the greasy floor. There was a single door at the far end, but it was locked, the handle rusted and unyielding. They'll break through, I said, my voice hoarse. We have to move. The man looked at me, his face pale and sweaty. There's nowhere to go. Once they've marked you, it's over, Marked? I demanded. He nodded, holding up his notebook. On one of the pages was a crude sketch of a rat, its eyes glowing like the ones in the tunnels. Surrounding it were strange symbols, almost like runes. They don't just attack at random. They choose their prey, those who've seen them, those who know too much. The weight of his words sank in. I thought back to the tunnels, to the moment I first saw them. The way their eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and calculating. "We're already dead," he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not giving up. Not like this." I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby shelf and limped toward the door. If the lock wouldn't budge, I'd break it. The man followed, his breathing shallow. "You don't understand. They're everywhere. Even if we get out of this room, they'll find us. They always do." "Then we make them fight for it," I snapped, raising the wrench. With a loud clang, I brought it down on the lock, again and again, until it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with more pipes. The air was thick and damp, the walls slick with moisture. A faint hum vibrated through the floor, like the heartbeat of the city above. "Come on," I urged, stepping into the corridor. The man hesitated, glancing back at the barricade. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. "They're waiting," he said. "Then let's not give them the chance," I replied, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. We moved as quickly as we could, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The corridor twisted and turned, branching off into dead ends and maintenance hatches. It was a maze, and with each step, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. Behind us, the silence broke. The scratching returned, louder and more frantic. "They found us." "This way," the man shouted, pointing to a ladder that led upward. It disappeared into the shadows above, but it was our only option. I climbed first, my injured ankle protesting with every movement. The metal rungs were slippery, and I gripped them tightly, my knuckles white. Below me, the man followed, his breath coming in short gasps. The scratching grew closer, accompanied by the now familiar screeches. I didn't dare look down. "Faster," the man yelled. The ladder led to a hatch, but it was jammed. I slammed my shoulder against it, panic surging through me. "It won't budge." "They're here," he screamed. I looked down and saw them, dozens of glowing eyes, a writhing mass of fur and teeth, pouring into the corridor below. With a final, desperate effort, I threw myself against the hatch. It burst open, and I scrambled onto solid ground, pulling the man up behind me. We were in a substation, the hum of machinery filling the air. Bright, white lights illuminated the room, momentarily blinding us. "They hate the light," the man said, his voice trembling. "It's the only thing that keeps them away." I scanned the room, my heart racing. There were switches and controls everywhere, but one stood out, a large lever labeled emergency floodlights. "Cover me," I yelled, running toward it. The man hesitated, then grabbed a nearby pipe, holding it like a weapon. The screeches echoed from the hatch as the first of the creatures emerged, their glowing eyes narrowing in the harsh light. I reached the lever and pulled it down with all my strength. The room was flooded with blinding light, every corner illuminated. The creatures recoiled, their screeches turning into shrieks of pain. But they didn't retreat. "They're adapting," the man shouted. I turned to see them crawling across the walls, their movements jerky but deliberate. They were avoiding the brightest spots, using the shadows to advance. They won't stop, the man said, backing away. Not until we're gone. I looked around desperately, my mind racing. There had to be something, some way to stop them for good. My eyes landed on a control panel labeled Main Power Shutdown. If we cut the power, the whole system will overload, the man said, realizing what I was thinking. It'll flood the tunnels with electricity. It might stop them. Might? I asked. It's all we've got. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes burning with hunger. I didn't have time to think. Get out of here, I told him. He shook his head. There's no time. With a deep breath, I reached for the control panel. Sparks flew as I yanked down the main switch. The hum of the machinery turned into a deafening roar, and the lights flickered wildly before plunging us into darkness. The last thing I saw was the swarm closing in, their glowing eyes the only light in the void. And then, silence. When I woke, the city was still. The power had returned, and the substation was empty. The man was gone, and so were the creatures. I stumbled outside, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the streets. People moved about, oblivious to what had happened beneath their feet. But I knew the truth. They weren't gone. Not really. They were just waiting. The Fugitive from the Dark Room. Have you ever been completely alone and yet felt someone watching? That suffocating sense of being hunted by something unseen, something you cannot escape? That's where it began for me, in the silence, in the shadows, in a place no one else could reach. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when my world was ordinary. My apartment in Brooklyn overlooked a busy intersection, the constant honking of cars and chatter of pedestrians creating a backdrop of normalcy. The nights were quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip of a leaky faucet. But then came the first whisper. It was a soft, scratching sound, faint but persistent, somewhere in the walls. Mice, I told myself. New York was full of them, wasn't it? I'd seen them scurry along subway platforms, darting between trash cans like tiny thieves. Still, this was different. The noise didn't fade. It grew louder with each passing night, scratching, tapping, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to communicate. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. It's nothing, I said aloud, trying to reassure myself. Just old pipes or the building settling. But when I turned off the lights, the feeling intensified. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. My reflection in the window didn't quite match my movements, lingering a moment too long after I'd turned away. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like an intrusion. My mind spun in circles, trying to rationalize what I couldn't explain. Then, one night, I saw it. It was just a glimpse, a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground, staring at me from the corner of the living room. I froze, the air catching in my lungs. They were too large, too bright to belong to a mouse. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the dusty floor and an empty corner. Get it together, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. But the fear lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. The next day, I called an exterminator. It's probably just rats, the man said, setting traps around the apartment. They can be pretty clever, but these will catch them. I nodded, not entirely convinced. The way he avoided my gaze, the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked, it was as if he felt it too, the presence I couldn't name. That night, the traps remained untouched. The scratching returned, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the apartment. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, burrowing into my mind. When the whispering began, I thought I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't words exactly, more like a low, guttural hum, rising and falling in waves. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, above, below, within the walls. It surrounded me, filling the space until it felt like the walls were closing in. I locked myself in the bathroom, the smallest, brightest room in the apartment. The harsh fluorescent light flickered overhead, but it was better than the suffocating darkness outside. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I backed into the corner, clutching a metal toilet brush like a weapon. My eyes were fixed on the crack beneath the bathroom door. A shadow passed by, long and distorted, as if the light outside was bending around something massive. "No," I breathed, shaking my head. "This isn't real. It's not real." The shadow lingered for a moment before disappearing. The apartment fell silent again, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the bathroom. I sat there for hours, my back pressed against the cold tile wall until the first rays of sunlight crept through the frosted window. When I finally emerged, the apartment felt wrong. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. The traps were still empty, but the faint smell of rot lingered in the air. I packed a bag and left, telling myself it was just for a night or two. A change of scenery, a chance to clear my head. But deep down, I knew I wasn't coming back. The thing in the shadows wasn't just in the apartment. It was in me now, watching, waiting. And I had no idea how to escape. The motel room wasn't much, but it was a reprieve, a sterile space with its harsh white walls and thin carpet. There was nothing personal here, nothing that could hold a memory or whisper in the dark. I thought I could rest, but the fear followed me like a shadow stitched to my heels. That night, I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling. My bag was still packed and sitting by the door, ready in case I needed to run again. My heart pounded in my chest, and every creak of the building sent a jolt through my body. "Just sleep," I told myself. "You're safe here." I closed my eyes, but the room didn't feel empty. It was subtle at first, a faint chill brushing against my skin, the sense of something shifting in the corners of my vision. I kept telling myself it was in my head, but the weight of the silence pressed against my ears. The sound came again. A scratching, faint and distant, like the rustling of leaves in a breeze. Only this wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic. It was searching for me. I sat up, gripping the edge of the bed. The sound seemed to move, sliding from one wall to the next, closing in. My breaths came shallow and fast, and I clenched my fists to stop my hands from trembling. The light flickered, casting distorted shadows across the room. I looked toward the door, half expecting to see it swing open, but it didn't move. Instead, the sound changed. The scratching became a low, guttural hum, vibrating through the air like a distant chant. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with a clarity that made my skin crawl. A whisper, soft and deliberate, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't run. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back against the wall. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a croak. The whispering stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it felt suffocating. My gaze darted to the window. Outside, the world was shrouded in darkness, the streetlights flickering like dying fireflies. I grabbed my bag and bolted. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped onto the empty street. The world felt too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to keep moving. The motel faded into the distance, and I found myself wandering through the labyrinth of New York's side streets. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every alleyway a gaping mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that the thing chasing me wasn't real. But the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every step. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and shrouded in darkness, standing at the far end of the street. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning, piercing, rooting me to the spot. "Go away," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then it stepped forward. I turned and ran. The city blurred around me, the streets twisting and bending in ways they shouldn't. No matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, just at the edge of my vision, its presence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. I stumbled into a subway station, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. The platform was deserted, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows across the cracked tiles. A train roared into the station, its brakes screeching like nails on a chalkboard. I didn't hesitate. I jumped on, the doors sliding shut behind me. The car was empty, save for a few scattered newspapers and a flickering light overhead. I slumped into a seat, clutching my bag to my chest. But the relief was short-lived. The train began to move, its rhythmical clattering echoing through the empty car. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. And then I felt it, a cold breath against the back of my neck. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there, sitting across from me, its face hidden in shadow. Its glowing eyes bored into mine, unblinking, unrelenting. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural hum. I shot to my feet, stumbling backward toward the door. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice echoing through the car. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, watching, waiting. The train plunged into darkness as it entered a tunnel, the flickering light overhead finally giving out. And in the pitch-black silence, the whispering began again. The whispers grew louder in the darkness, each word indistinct but filled with a malice that clawed at my sanity. My breath came in short gasps, my back pressed against the cold metal of the train door. "Stop!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the void. A flicker of light returned, dim and unreliable, casting a strobe-like glow across the car. The figure was no longer seated. It stood in the center of the aisle, impossibly tall, its form swaying as though caught in an unseen wind. The train lurched violently, and I fell to the floor, scraping my palms on the dirty metal. The overhead light flared, blinding me for a moment, and when it dimmed again, the figure was closer. It didn't walk. It didn't move in any way I could comprehend. It simply was, shifting through space like a shadow creeping along the walls. The train screeched to a halt. The force threw me forward, and my head slammed against a pole. Pain bloomed across my skull, but I forced myself to my feet. The doors hissed open behind me, revealing a platform bathed in an unnatural red light. I didn't think. I ran. The station was unlike any I'd seen before, its walls covered in strange, pulsating patterns, as though the concrete itself was alive. The air was thick, humid, and carried a metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was there, standing at the mouth of the train car. It didn't chase me, didn't rush forward. It just watched, its glowing eyes pinning me in place. But then the whispers began again, this time from everywhere. They echoed off the walls, resonating deep within my chest. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside me now, twisting my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my sanity. You can't run. You can't hide. This is your end. No! I screamed, stumbling down the platform. I spotted a staircase leading upward and bolted for it, my legs trembling with every step. The whispers grew fainter as I ascended, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, the red glow fading into darkness above me. I climbed until my legs burned, until my breaths came in ragged gasps. And then, finally, I reached the top. A single door stood before me, its surface battered and scratched. I pushed it open, desperate for escape. But I wasn't outside. I was in a hallway, a long, narrow corridor with walls that seemed to close in the farther I walked. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, their hum grating against my ears. The whispers returned, faint and distant, growing louder with every step. I kept moving, my hands brushing against the walls for balance. The air was colder now, each breath visible in the dim light. And then I saw them, marks etched into the walls, deep gouges that formed strange, looping patterns. They looked like claw marks. The hallway opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The ground beneath my feet was damp, and the air reeked of decay. At the center of the room was a pit, a yawning chasm that seemed to devour the light around it. I stepped closer, drawn to its edge despite the dread coiling in my stomach. My reflection stared back at me from the surface of the black water that filled the pit. It shimmered, rippling as though alive. And then the reflection moved. It smiled. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. The surface of the water broke, and something began to rise, a shape, twisted and wrong, its form shifting and writhing as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The whispers converged into a single voice. "Welcome home." I turned to run, but the figure from the train was there, blocking my path. Its eyes burned brighter now, searing into my mind. "You can't escape this," it said, its voice a chorus of the whispers. "You brought yourself here." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." The figure stepped closer, its form towering over me. "Isn't it?" The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt the pull of the pit, its gravity dragging me toward its edge. My feet slid across the damp floor, and I clawed at the ground, desperate to hold on. "Please!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The figure knelt beside me, its face inches from mine. For the first time, I saw its features, or rather, the lack of them. Its face was a blank canvas, smooth and featureless, save for the burning eyes. "You can't run from yourself," it whispered. And then it pushed me. I fell, the darkness swallowing me whole. The fall wasn't what I expected. There was no rush of air, no sensation of weightlessness. Instead, it felt like sinking into a thick, suffocating void. My screams echoed back at me, distorted and warped as though the darkness was mocking my fear. Time lost all meaning. Was I falling for seconds, minutes, or hours? I couldn't tell. My thoughts became fragmented, fraying at the edges like an old photograph. And then, suddenly, I stopped. The impact never came. One moment, I was plunging into nothingness. The next, I was standing in a room I recognized immediately. It was my childhood bedroom. The small wooden bed, the faded blue wallpaper with stars and moons, the stack of comic books on the nightstand, all exactly as I remembered. Except, something was off. The walls seemed too close, the ceiling too low. The air was heavy, almost syrupy, and carried a faint, acrid smell that stung my nose. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath me. The sound was wrong, too loud, like a scream in an empty auditorium. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I moved toward the bed, my hand brushing against the coarse fabric of the quilt. Memories flooded back unbidden, nights spent hiding under this blanket, convinced that the shadows in the corners of the room were alive. As if on cue, the shadows began to move. They stretched and twisted, spilling across the walls like ink in water. My breath hitched as they coalesced into a shape, a figure that mirrored the one from the train. "You've been running for so long," it said, its voice softer now, almost kind. "I don't know what you want," I whispered, backing away. "You do." The walls trembled, the stars and moons peeling away to reveal raw, pulsing flesh beneath. The bed warped, its wooden frame twisting into gnarled, skeletal fingers that reached for me. I turned and ran, throwing open the door and stumbling into a corridor. It wasn't the hallway of my childhood home. It was the same narrow, oppressive corridor I had escaped earlier, the one with claw marks etched into the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their words blending into a mantra. "Face it. Face it. Face it." I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The words weren't external, they were inside me, reverberating through my skull. The corridor twisted and bent, the walls closing in until I was forced to crawl. My hands scraped against the jagged surface, and I felt warm blood trickle down my fingers. Ahead, a faint light appeared, flickering like a dying flame. I crawled toward it, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I emerged, I found myself in another room. This one was stark and clinical, its white walls sterile and unyielding. A single chair sat in the center, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Above it hung a light bulb, swinging gently as though disturbed by an invisible breeze. In the chair sat me. My double looked up, its eyes hollow and rimmed with shadows. It smiled, a cold, joyless smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You've been avoiding this moment," it said, its voice identical to mine. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "This is the truth," it replied, standing. "The part of yourself you've buried. The part you refuse to face." "I don't understand." "You will." The light overhead flared, blinding me. When it dimmed, the figure was gone. In its place stood a mirror, its surface cracked and splintered. I stepped closer, my reflection shifting and distorting with each step. While I was just inches away, the cracks in the mirror began to spread, spidering outward until the entire surface was fractured. And then it shattered. Behind the broken glass was a void, a swirling mass of darkness and light filled with shapes that defied comprehension. I felt its pull, an irresistible force dragging me closer. No! I screamed, clawing at the ground. I'm not ready. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their voices overlapping in a deafening roar. You were never ready. The void consumed me. I awoke in silence. The oppressive weight was gone. The whispers had ceased. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to a pale, gray light that surrounded me. For a moment, I thought I was floating, suspended in nothingness. Then I realized I was lying on a surface, cold, smooth, and solid. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy and uncooperative. The ground stretched infinitely in all directions, a barren expanse of dull stone that faded into a horizonless mist. Ahead of me stood the mirror. It was whole again, its surface pristine and unbroken. But this time, my reflection wasn't just me, it was everything. Every fear, every memory, every failure I had tried to forget. The reflection shifted constantly, replaying moments of shame, pain, and regret. Why am I here? I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The mirror rippled, its surface shimmering like water. And then the figure appeared again, my double, or perhaps the part of me I'd spent my life avoiding. You've always been here, it said. What does that mean? This is where you come when you run, it replied, its tone calm, almost pitying. This is the dark room you've built for yourself. A prison made of fear and denial. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I've been fighting, trying to escape. You've been hiding, it corrected, stepping closer. Running from the truth. But you can't run forever. The mirror behind it began to change. The images flickered, becoming clearer, sharper. I saw myself as a child, cowering in my room, afraid of the shadows. I saw myself as a teenager, lashing out in anger, unable to face the pain of loss. I saw myself as an adult, drowning in a sea of anxiety and self-doubt, refusing to acknowledge the growing weight inside me. The scenes blended together, a montage of moments I had tried to bury. I don't want to see this, I said, backing away. But you must, it said, its voice firm. Because this is who you are. This is the truth you've avoided your entire life. I don't want this. I shouted. I want to be free. To be free, you must face it. The figure raised its hand, and the mirror cracked once more. This time, the cracks spread across the ground and sky, fracturing the entire world. And then I was falling again, tumbling through a kaleidoscope of memories and emotions. Each fragment of the broken world carried a piece of my life, a memory, a fear, a truth I had denied. The falling stopped abruptly, and I was back in the train. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The carriage was empty, save for me and my reflection in the window. But the reflection wasn't mine. It was the figure. It smiled, its expression cold and knowing. You can leave, it said, its voice echoing in my head. But you'll always carry this with you. The train doors hissed open, revealing a platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the spot. Go, it urged. Step into the world you've been running from. Or stay here, in the dark, forever. I stepped off the train. The platform dissolved around me, replaced by a familiar street bathed in early morning light. I was home, or at least, I thought I was. But something had changed. The world seemed sharper, more vivid. Every sound, every color, every sensation was heightened. I felt the weight of my memories, my fears, my regrets pressing against me, but for the first time, I didn't run. The figure's words echoed in my mind as I walked, my steps unsteady but deliberate. You always carry this with you. I understood now. The dark room wasn't something I could escape, it was part of me. But it didn't have to define me. As the sun rose, casting golden light over the city, I took a deep breath and kept walking. And the dark room stayed behind me. Footprints at sunset. I've always hated the tunnels. Even before the reports, the whispers, the stories that passed like wildfire among the crews, I felt it, the oppressive weight of the city pressing down through layers of concrete and steel. It wasn't the darkness that got to me, or even the claustrophobia. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that eats at you, magnifying every creak and groan, every distant echo, until your own breathing sounds like a storm. We were on the night shift again. I was leading the maintenance team down into one of the oldest sections of the New York City subway. The air down there always felt different, stale, heavy, like it had been sitting still for decades. My boots echoed on the damp concrete, a steady rhythm I focused on to keep my mind from wandering. You hear about Martin? Jackson asked, his voice cutting through the gloom. I glanced back at him. He was carrying the toolbox, his flashlight sweeping across the grimy walls. What about him? He quit, Jackson said, his tone low. Said he saw something last week. Big. Eyes like flashlights. Rats, I muttered. This place is full of them. Not rats, Jackson said, shaking his head. He swears it was something else. Said it was watching him. I didn't respond. Stories like this were common among the crews. Spend enough time in the tunnels, and your mind starts to play tricks on you. Shadows shift, sounds echo in strange ways. It's easy to let fear take over. But as we moved deeper into the tunnel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first sign was the smell. It hit me suddenly, sharp, metallic, and wrong. Like rust mixed with decay. I stopped, holding up a hand to signal the others. What is it? Jackson asked, stepping up beside me. I didn't answer. My flashlight beam swept across the floor, illuminating a trail of dark, with streaks leading off into the shadows. Blood? Jackson whispered. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't sure. The substance glistened unnaturally, almost oily, and the sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. We followed the trail, our footsteps cautious now, the silence broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional drip of water. The streaks led us to an old maintenance alcove, a small space carved into the wall where workers used to store tools. That's where we saw it. The claw marks. They were gouged deep into the concrete, parallel lines that stretched across the wall in uneven patterns. Each groove was at least an inch wide, the edges jagged and rough. What the hell did that? Jackson breathed, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding now, and my mind raced through every rational explanation I could think of. A piece of equipment, maybe. Or vandalism. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't the work of machines or people. Let's keep moving, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We pressed on, the air growing colder with every step. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the darkness pressing in around us. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like scratching. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Jackson nodded, his eyes wide. The others were silent, their faces tense. The scratching grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random scurrying of rats. It was deliberate, purposeful, like something was dragging its claws against the walls. "Turn off the lights," I whispered. "What?" "Why?" Jackson hissed. "Just do it." Reluctantly, we switched off our flashlights, plunging the tunnel into darkness. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching continued, joined now by a faint clicking sound, like nails tapping against stone. And then I saw them. 2 points of light, faint but unmistakable, glinting in the distance. They moved slowly, deliberately, bobbing slightly as if whatever they belonged to was stalking us. "Eyes," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay still," I murmured, my pulse thundering in my ears. The lights grew brighter, closer. I could make out the faint outline of a shape now, low to the ground, hunched, its movements unnervingly smooth. My rational mind screamed at me to look away, to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the gaze of those unblinking eyes. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. The scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even more oppressive than the noise. "Go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Now." We didn't argue. We turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the concrete as we raced back the way we came. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the walls, illuminating graffiti and rusted pipes, but no sign of whatever had been following us. When we finally emerged into the open air, gasping for breath, I turned to Jackson. "Tell no one," I said, my voice firm. He nodded, his face pale. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was down there, it wasn't finished with us. The days after that night passed in a haze. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach, the one that told me something had changed. That something down there was awake, waiting. Jackson and the others didn't bring it up again, but I could see it in their eyes. They were scared. I was too, though I didn't admit it to anyone, not even to myself. At work, we kept our heads down. We stayed out of the old tunnels, sticking to the safer, better-lit sections of the system. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It started small. One morning, while I was down on the platform alone, I found deep scratches on the wall, like those in the tunnel. They weren't there the day before. And when I passed them, I could swear I heard something moving in the darkness behind me, just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. But when I turned, nothing was there. I told myself I was being paranoid. But I knew deep down that something was wrong. Weeks passed. We tried to act normal. But it was getting harder. Every time we went down into the tunnels, the silence felt heavier. The shadows longer. Then the disappearances started. It was a worker, another night shift guy named Rick. I didn't know him well, but I knew he'd been working in the tunnels the night before. When we showed up the next morning, he was gone. Just vanished. No sign of a struggle, no sign of him at all. The company didn't make a big deal out of it. They just sent us another worker to fill his spot, as if it was just another ordinary disappearance. But I saw it in their eyes too. They knew something was happening. They just didn't want to face it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he just walked off. Maybe he'd gone on a drinking binge or gotten into trouble. But deep down, I knew the truth. Rick had seen something. Maybe it had been one of them. I started to notice more strange things. One evening, while I was walking back to my locker after my shift, I passed a maintenance room. The door was ajar, and I heard faint sounds coming from inside. It was a soft rustling, like something was moving around in the dark. I pushed the door open, heart pounding in my chest. Inside, everything looked normal. Tools hung neatly on the walls, the floor was clean, the lights flickered faintly overhead. But then I saw it. A trail of dark marks leading from the back of the room, disappearing under the floorboards. I bent down, my hands trembling, and reached for the boards. As I pulled them back, a cold rush of air hit my face, like something had been waiting down there, breathing, watching. Under the floor, there was nothing. But the marks, those dark, oily streaks, stretched further into the shadows. I slammed the floorboards back into place and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger each day. The sounds, the shapes, the eyes, everything was closing in. Then, one night, everything changed. I was down in the tunnels with Jackson again, the only one still brave, or foolish, enough to work the graveyard shift. The air felt thick, heavy, and I could see my breath clouding in the flashlight beam. We were at the edge of the tunnel, near the old station that hadn't been used in years. The walls here were covered in peeling tiles, some of which had been cracked wide open. As we worked to patch them up, I heard the scratching. It was louder now. Closer. Jackson looked up from the floor where he was working. "You hear that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah." Before we could react, something moved in the darkness ahead of us. It was fast, a blur of motion, too quick for me to see clearly. But there was something unmistakable about the way it moved, something wrong. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. Then, out of the shadows, a massive shape lunged toward us. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed Jackson's arm and yanked him backward, pulling him toward the exit. We ran, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we stumbled toward the light. The scratching followed us, relentless, as if it was gaining on us with every step. I turned back, half expecting to see something right on our heels. But the darkness was empty. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air. Jackson was trembling, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We didn't go back into the tunnels after that. And when the sun came up, we told the foreman we were done. We'd seen enough. But the truth is, I know that whatever is down there, it's not done with us. Not by a long shot. And somehow, I know it's still watching. The days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Jackson and I both stayed off the clock, away from the tunnels. But there was no peace to be found in the city above. I couldn't shake the image of what I saw, those dark shapes, that presence lurking just beyond the light. I started to hear things at night. Scratching, just like before. But now it wasn't just the tunnels, it was the walls of my apartment, the floorboards creaking in the dead of night. Every time I turned my back, I felt something there, lurking just out of sight. Jackson called me the day after we quit the job. He sounded panicked. "You're not gonna believe this, man," he said. "I've been looking into it. The disappearances, the stuff that happened down there, it's not the first time." I listened, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" There's a history, man. A few years ago, a whole crew of workers vanished in the same spot, right around the area we were in. No one ever found them. Just gone. And no one talked about it. I tried to stay calm, but his words rattled me. What happened to them? I don't know. But I think we're dealing with something bigger than just a few missing people. My mind raced. The dark marks, the eyes in the shadows, the way the air felt in those tunnels, it was all connected. But how? What was down there? I think we need to find out what it is, Jackson continued. I don't know if I can just walk away from it. Not after everything that's happened. Jackson, don't go back down there, I pleaded. We barely made it out last time. I have to, he said. I need answers. The line went dead before I could stop him. I should have told him to stay away. I should have told him it wasn't worth it. But a part of me, the same part that had kept me going down into those tunnels despite the fear, wanted to know. What was really down there? What were we dealing with? I spent the next few days in a fog, half waiting for Jackson to call me, half terrified of what he might find. But no call came. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon again, I knew I couldn't stay away any longer. I had to go back. Not for work, but to find Jackson. The city was quieter than usual when I arrived at the station. It was late, just after midnight. I stepped into the terminal, the sound of my shoes echoing on the tile floors. The familiar scent of old concrete and rust filled the air, but it smelled different tonight, heavier, more oppressive. I took the stairs down into the maintenance area, heart thumping with every step. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows. The place felt empty, almost hollow. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change. The silence became thick, suffocating. I could feel my pulse quicken as I passed familiar sections of the tunnel, all the while feeling something staring back at me from the dark. Then, just as I thought I was imagining things, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, soft but unmistakable. It was distant at first, like the sound of claws on concrete. But it was coming closer. I froze. The sound stopped. A long pause. Then, faint footsteps, dragging, slow. It wasn't Jackson. I couldn't tell who it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a cautious step forward. A whisper came from the dark ahead. Help. It was Jackson's voice. But there was something wrong with it. It was strained, almost garbled, like he was choking. Jackson? I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. Only that dragging sound. Closer and closer. I hesitated, then moved toward the sound, guided by the dim light of my flashlight. The narrow tunnel twisted ahead, disappearing into darkness. And with every step I took, the scratching and dragging sounds grew louder. It felt like something was crawling just out of sight, watching me. Then I saw it. Jackson was slumped against the wall, his body pale, covered in dirt and grime. His eyes were wide open, staring ahead, unblinking. There was something in them, something wrong. His mouth opened, but the words that came out weren't what I expected. It's them. They're here. They're watching us. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And that's when I saw it. Behind Jackson, in the deepest corner of the tunnel, something moved. It wasn't a shadow. It was too real. I couldn't make out its full shape, but I saw eyes, dozens of them, glowing, reflecting the dim light in a sickly yellow hue. And then I heard it, the same sound that had haunted my dreams, the skittering of claws, the hiss of breath. The thing was too close. Too close. "Jackson, get up!" I screamed, shaking him, but his body felt limp, like a rag doll. His eyes remained fixed on the dark shape moving toward us. And then I saw the feet, long, twisted, clawed feet, dragging along the floor. The creature stepped into the dim light, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. Its body was massive, a twisted, grotesque version of a rat, its fur matted with filth. The eyes were too large, too many. The thing was covered in scratches, like it had been scraping the walls for years. I turned and ran, but the tunnel stretched on forever. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the screeching and the skittering, getting closer and closer. My heart was pounding, my breath ragged, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was back on the surface, gasping for air. I don't know what happened to Jackson, but I know that whatever it was in those tunnels, it's still down there, waiting. And I don't know if I'll ever be free from it. The footprints at sunset? They were never a warning. They were a promise. The city never felt the same again. The streets seemed emptier, the air heavier, as if something unseen had settled in, watching, waiting. I kept expecting to hear Jackson's voice, or even just the distant shuffle of feet in the tunnels. But all I heard was silence. And the silence was worse than anything I had encountered in the darkness below. I tried to go about my days, getting back to a normal routine. I went back to work, spoke to friends, did everything I could to distract myself from what happened. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jackson's empty stare. The way his lips moved, but the words he spoke didn't reach me. And then there was that thing. That creature. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. The countless, glowing eyes. It felt like they were still watching me, no matter where I went. At night, I locked myself in my apartment, drawing the blinds, trying to keep the world out. But the fear always crept in, sneaking under the door, slipping into my thoughts. I heard whispers, scraping sounds from the walls, too quiet to be real, too vivid to ignore. Every creak of the floorboard, every flicker of the lights, made my heart race. But the worst part, the part one didn't want to admit to myself, was that I felt it. It was still out there. Whatever was in the tunnels, whatever had come for Jackson, was still waiting for me. And I couldn't run from it forever. I found myself returning to the station against all better judgment. Something was pulling me back, as though there was unfinished business. I'd already seen the horrors of the dark corridors, but it was the idea of Jackson, his last, desperate words, that drove me to return. I couldn't let him be the last one to face this. I had to know what it was. That evening, just after sunset, I found myself back at the entrance to the maintenance tunnels. The place felt colder than it should have been, even for a city deep underground. I hesitated, my hand resting on the door, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around. But I didn't. I stepped inside, and the familiar scent of decay and old pipes washed over me. The air was thick, the atmosphere heavy with the promise of something worse lurking just around the corner. The lights flickered above me as I walked deeper into the station, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That this was just another abandoned part of the city, forgotten and abandoned, a relic of old infrastructure. But I knew better. I heard it then. the soft scrape of something dragging along the floor. A shadow flickered just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, it was gone. It's just your mind playing tricks, I told myself. But the fear clawed at my insides, relentless. I moved forward, drawn into the very heart of the darkness. The deeper I ventured, the more the tunnel seemed to close in on me. The walls were covered in grime, a damp smell in the air, but it wasn't just the smell of mold. It was something older, something that felt wrong. I could almost taste the fear that had settled here long before I ever stepped foot. And then I saw it. The faintest trace of a footprint. A dark stain on the concrete floor, smeared in a way that made my stomach turn. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I touched the mark. It was sticky, like oil. But when I pulled my hand back, the tip of my finger was covered in a strange, viscous substance. The kind of substance that made my skin crawl, like something was watching me. A sound came from the distance. A scratching noise, louder this time. More urgent. I straightened up quickly, my heart thudding against my ribs. I stepped further into the tunnel, the sounds growing clearer. Then I saw the eyes. They glowed in the dark, hundreds of them, gleaming like fireflies. But these weren't fireflies. They were something else, too large, too unnatural. I couldn't count them all, the way they flickered and darted from side to side. The eyes blinked in sync, a soft, eerie rhythm. My breath caught. This is it. This is the thing I've been running from. I wasn't alone anymore. There were more than just shadows, more than just sounds. There were things in the dark, and they were watching me. My feet felt frozen to the floor as I stood there, my mind racing for any explanation, any reason this wasn't happening. But nothing made sense. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of claws on concrete, followed by a low, guttural hiss. The ground vibrated as something large shifted in the dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I turned and bolted. The tunnel stretched ahead, darker and colder than I remembered. The sound of scraping followed me, faster now, echoing off the walls as I ran. I could feel something behind me, could almost feel the heat of its breath on my neck. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I was going to collapse, the exit was in sight. But as I approached the stairs, I felt it. The weight, the pressure, like something was forcing me back. I looked over my shoulder just as I reached the door, and there it was. The creature. It was massive, easily towering over me. Its body was like a grotesque hybrid of rat and insect, but far larger, far more terrifying. Its teeth gleamed as it hissed, stepping closer. It was too late. It was too close. My hand grasped the door handle, my body shaking with panic. But I couldn't open it. And then, there was the sound of the doors opening behind me. The cold air hit me, and I knew there was no escaping this. But just as the creature lunged, I felt myself pulled backward. A hand, warm, familiar, gripped my wrist, pulling me out of the way. It was Jackson. His face was pale, eyes wild, but he was alive. "Get out," he shouted, pulling me through the door just as the creature shrieked in fury. We didn't look back. We ran, blindly, through the station, the echoes of the creature's screeches ringing in our ears. We were alive, but how much longer? We didn't know. But we had escaped, at least for now. But I knew it wasn't over. Those things, they were still down there. And sooner or later, they would come for us again. And next time, they wouldn't let us go. The footprints at sunset were no longer a warning. They were a promise. I didn't sleep for days after that. The nightmares came like clockwork, visions of glowing eyes and gnashing teeth, the stench of decay clinging to the air. I could still hear the shrill screech of that creature echoing in my mind even while I was awake. I couldn't escape it. Jackson and I didn't speak much after we left the station. We both understood that words wouldn't make any of it easier. What we had seen, what we had escaped, couldn't be processed in a way that made sense. Every attempt to speak about it felt like it would tear at the fragile thread of sanity that still held me together. The city felt different now. The shadows were longer, the streets emptier. Every corner seemed to hold a threat, every flicker of movement an omen. I had become hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of a door, every whisper of wind. I thought the fear would subside, but it only grew, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that they were still out there, waiting. I knew we couldn't keep running. Whatever we had disturbed down there in the tunnels wasn't something that would just disappear. Jackson and I had tried to bury it, to pretend we were safe, but there was no escaping the truth. One morning, about a week after the incident, I woke up to find Jackson missing. His apartment was as silent as mine had been for days. No message. No warning. Just gone. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew, in my gut, what had happened. He'd gone back. It was the only explanation. And maybe, in a way, I understood. Jackson was a man of action. He couldn't live with what we had seen without knowing more. But I wasn't sure I could go back to that place to face whatever had been waiting in the darkness for us. But I couldn't leave him to face it alone. I went to the station. The entrance to the tunnels had been sealed off, police tape warning that the area was under investigation. I knew better than to trust the authorities. Whatever was down there was beyond their understanding. I found a way in, sneaking through an old service entrance and making my way into the maintenance tunnels once again. The air felt colder this time, heavier, as though the darkness was more aware of me than before. I walked carefully, cautiously, every step taking me deeper into the void. The tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the walls pulsating with an eerie energy. I could feel something watching me again, and I wasn't sure whether it was real or a figment of my own paranoia. Then, just as I rounded a corner, I saw it. Jackson. He was standing at the edge of a small, narrow chamber, his back to me. His face was blank, emotionless, as if the person I once knew was gone. The same glazed look that had consumed him when he spoke to me in the tunnels last time. He didn't turn as I approached. Jackson? I called, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, but then, the floor beneath me shifted. The ground trembled, and the walls seemed to close in, the pressure mounting as the temperature dropped. A guttural growl echoed from deep within the darkness, sending a shiver down my spine. Jackson finally turned, and when he looked at me, his eyes were empty. Hollow. There was something off about him, something fundamentally wrong. I could feel it now, the creatures. They were near, watching us. I could sense them moving through the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light, their eyes burning like fireflies in the dark. The creature that had chased us before was standing just behind Jackson now, its massive body casting an oppressive shadow over him. Its grotesque, insect-like features shimmered in the low light, and its eyes, they were everywhere. Jackson's lips parted, but it wasn't him who spoke. "You should have stayed away," a voice whispered, hissing like 1,000 mouths speaking in unison. It wasn't Jackson's voice. It was something else. My heart raced. I had to get out. But as I turned to run, the walls seemed to warp, the air thick with a heavy, oppressive weight. I was trapped. And then I heard it, scraping, scratching, as though hundreds of claws were dragging across the ground, coming closer with each passing second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My legs were frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked back at Jackson one last time, and for a fleeting moment, I saw him, the man I had known, standing there behind those empty eyes, a faint trace of recognition in his gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. I stumbled backward, terror overwhelming my every thought, as the creature lunged at me. And then, everything went dark. When I woke, I was outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. I was lying on the ground, covered in dirt and sweat. My head throbbed, but I could feel my heart still beating in my chest. I was alive. I didn't know how long I had been out. There was no sign of Jackson. No sign of the creature. The tunnels were silent. But I could feel it, they were still there, beneath the city, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that they would never stop. They would never leave us alone. The footprints at sunset were a warning. A curse. And I was no longer sure I could escape it. Black mirrors. Have you ever stood before a mirror, wondering if it's just reflecting your image, or if something else is staring back at you? It's a strange feeling, like something in the glass is almost alive. You tell yourself it's nothing. A trick of the light, a momentary shift in your reflection. But deep down, you can't shake the feeling that something is watching you. That's how it started for me. At first, it was just a fleeting sense of discomfort. I thought I was imagining it. After all, mirrors are just glass, right? Just a surface that shows your image, nothing more. But what if that's not the truth? I was a reporter at one of the largest newspapers in New York City, always chasing the next big story. The city had its own rhythm, a pulse that beat through every street, every building. But lately, there had been whispers, strange happenings, odd occurrences that couldn't be explained. People seeing things in mirrors, visions of their futures. It started small. A man in a cafe, staring at the bathroom mirror, suddenly screamed and ran out. The same day, a woman in a department store did the same thing, shaking in terror as she gazed into the reflective surface. No one could explain it. The police were called, but no one was hurt. Still, people began to talk. Rumors spread. Something was wrong. The phenomenon escalated over the course of a few days. More and more people were affected. Some said they saw glimpses of their deaths, others their worst fears. It didn't make sense. It sounded insane. But one thing was undeniable, the fear was real. It spread faster than any disease. As a journalist, I couldn't ignore it. I had to dig deeper. I spent my days interviewing witnesses, speaking with experts, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the more I uncovered, the less I understood. There were no common factors between the victims. Some had never been to the same places, others had no connections at all. It was as if the mirrors were targeting random people, showing them a future they couldn't control. And then, one night, as I walked home from work, I found myself standing before a large antique mirror in the hallway of my apartment building. It wasn't the best place for a mirror, old, cracked, its edges chipped and worn, but it was there, hanging on the wall like a forgotten relic. I passed it 100 times before, never thinking much of it. But that night, I stopped. I didn't mean to, but I did. The air in the hallway felt thicker, colder somehow. The silence around me seemed to grow heavier. I looked into the glass. At first, it was just my reflection. The same tired, weary face I'd seen in the mirror every day for years. But then, something changed. For a split second, I saw something else, something in the reflection. It was faint at first, a shadow, a flicker of movement behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. I looked back at the mirror, my heart pounding now, and I saw it again. This time, it wasn't a shadow. There was someone behind me, standing just a few feet away. They were taller than me, their figure dark and distorted. I couldn't make out their face. The figure was like smoke, shifting in and out of focus. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure wasn't just in the mirror, it was in the hallway too. It was standing there, just out of sight, as if it were waiting for something. Or someone. I took a step back, my pulse racing. I should have run. I should have turned and fled right then. But something kept me rooted to the spot. And then I saw it, what it wanted me to see. In the reflection, the figure's face twisted into something horrible. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The mirror was once again just a mirror, reflecting only my startled expression. I felt my stomach twist with unease. I told myself I had imagined it. It had to be a trick of the light, a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. As I walked away from the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That whatever I had just seen wasn't just a glimpse of a future, but a warning. A warning of what was to come. The days that followed were filled with the same unease that had settled over me after that moment in the mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about it, the figure, its twisted face, those hollow eyes that seemed to see me in ways I couldn't understand. I knew it wasn't a hallucination, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. I had to investigate. The phenomenon was spreading across the city, and it wasn't just people in my neighborhood. Witnesses were describing the same thing, strange visions, glimpses of futures they weren't supposed to see. Some even said they'd seen their own deaths, each detail so vivid that it seemed impossible to ignore. I needed answers. I dug deeper, speaking with psychologists, spiritualists, and even a few paranormal investigators. The more I learned, the more the situation seemed to spiral out of control. There was no pattern, no explanation. No one could say what triggered the visions or why it was happening to certain people. But as I listened to these experts, something kept nagging at me, something I couldn't explain. They all mentioned one thing: mirrors. Every single person who had experienced these terrifying glimpses had been looking into a mirror when it happened. A simple, everyday object. I began to wonder if I had been looking in the wrong places. Maybe the mirrors themselves were the key. That night, I decided to return to the scene of my own encounter, the hallway with the old mirror. I didn't know why. It was reckless, and I knew it. But the curiosity, the need to understand, was overpowering. I arrived just after sunset, the building quiet and dark. The air felt thick, like the whole place was holding its breath. As I stood before the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just outside of my vision. I took a deep breath and slowly stepped closer. The glass was cold to the touch, a faint layer of dust clinging to its surface. My reflection looked back at me, but my heart began to race again. I felt it, the same feeling I had the other night, like I was being pulled into the glass. I stared into my own eyes, watching my reflection. My face looked different in the dim light, sharper somehow, more defined. But as I watched, the change began. I blinked, and suddenly, my reflection wasn't just me anymore. There was someone else standing beside me, a figure that wasn't there in the room. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, but then the figure moved. It was tall, its shape distorted, just like the one I'd seen before. It was silent, its movements unnaturally slow. I backed away, my breath quickening. But the figure in the reflection didn't move with me. It remained frozen in place, watching. And then, just like before, it shifted. The figure's face became clearer. It wasn't the blank, shapeless horror I had seen the first time. No. This time, I saw the face of someone I knew. It was my own. But it was wrong. My reflection, my mirrored self, grinned at me. A wide, twisted grin that wasn't mine. It wasn't just the smile, either. There was something about the eyes, something in the way it looked at me. Cold, distant, like it wasn't really me at all. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze from the mirror. And then it spoke. A voice, distorted and faint, echoed from within the glass. "It's too late," it whispered, barely audible, but chilling in its finality. I could feel my pulse quicken, panic setting in. I forced myself to look away, stumbling backward until I hit the wall behind me. My head spun. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of the mirror was pulling me deeper into its grip. I looked back toward the mirror one last time, expecting to see only my reflection. But the figure was still there. The reflection of me, grinning, cold-eyed, waiting. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of the dread that had settled into my bones. But the sound grew louder. A skittering, like something moving quickly, brushing against the walls. I turned, my feet moving of their own accord as I rushed toward the stairs. The scratching sound followed, growing closer with each step I took. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. No one. But the sound was real. It wasn't just in my head. I reached the exit door and threw it open, breathing heavily. The street outside was empty, the city just as bustling as it always was. But for some reason, it felt different tonight, darker, more oppressive. I kept walking, not sure where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away. The scratching still echoed in my ears, though. It followed me even outside. And in that moment, I realized something far worse than any vision. The mirrors weren't just showing people the future. They were showing them something else. Something waiting for them, hidden in the dark. Something that would never leave. I couldn't escape it. The fear, the nagging thought at the back of my mind, the constant sensation that something was watching me. The reflection in the mirror, that twisted version of myself, it wasn't just a vision. It was real. And it wasn't going away. I couldn't shake the memory of those words, It's too late. The voice echoed in my mind, haunting every waking moment. I tried to distract myself, to ignore the ever-present shiver down my spine, but it was futile. Every time I looked into any reflective surface, I saw it. The figure, myself, or something like me, grinning, cold-eyed, waiting for the moment to move. I couldn't escape the mirrors. I couldn't escape what they were showing me. The news didn't help. Stories of people who had been touched by the phenomenon were spreading like wildfire. It was happening everywhere, on the subway, in homes, even in public restrooms. It was as if the entire city had become trapped in some endless cycle, unable to break free from the grip of the glass. But I couldn't just sit back and let it consume me. I had to find answers, had to understand why this was happening. I needed to know if there was any way to stop it before it took me, too. I began visiting more places, research libraries, obscure occult shops, and even mental health clinics that had started to see a strange influx of people. Every conversation led to the same dead ends, though. No one had any real explanation. One night, I found myself at a small, dimly lit cafe, sitting across from a man who claimed to have some answers. He was an older fellow, wearing a tattered jacket, his face gaunt and weary. His eyes glimmered with a strange intensity, and as he spoke, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "You're not the only one," he said, leaning in close, his voice barely a whisper. "There are others who've seen it, you know? The mirror. The reflection. It's not just a random occurrence. It's something deliberate." "Deliberate?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" His eyes flickered nervously, as though someone might be listening. He looked around the cafe and then lowered his voice further. "It's a curse, a warning, a signal from something beyond. These mirrors, they are opening windows. Windows into other realities. Places where the past and future aren't linear. Where the reflections aren't just illusions, but extensions of something darker." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Windows to other realities?" I repeated. "So you're saying these reflections, they're not us? There's something else?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. Something else. But worse than that, these reflections, these other versions of us, they have their own lives. Their own plans. And when they start to show themselves, it's already too late. They've been waiting. And now, they want to take over." A chill ran down my spine. "Take over?" He leaned back, as if the weight of the words was too much for him to bear. "I don't know what they are exactly. Some say they're creatures. Others think they're ghosts, or echoes from another dimension. But one thing is clear, they want to replace us. And when they do, they'll leave us trapped, looking into a mirror, seeing them in our place." I sat there in stunned silence. What he was saying made no sense, yet it felt true in a way I couldn't ignore. Everything had been so real, the reflection, the voice, the presence I felt watching me. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. Something unnatural. How do I stop it? I asked urgently. The man sighed, a deep, resigned breath. "You can't. Not completely. There's a way to fight it, but it's dangerous. You'll have to face your reflection directly. Face it until you understand what it wants. But even then, it's not guaranteed to work." I could feel my heart racing, panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to accept this. I couldn't. How do I even begin? I whispered, my voice shaking. The man looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow. You have to find the source. Whatever is causing these mirrors to show these reflections. Find it, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to stop it before it's too late. But what source could there possibly be? And if I did find it, would I be able to stop it before my reflection, my own twisted self, replaced me entirely? That night, I returned home, feeling heavier than before. As I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, I hesitated. The reflection stared back at me, the silence between us deafening. I could almost feel the tension in the air, like the mirror itself was alive, waiting for me to make a move. But when I looked closer, I saw it. The figure, my reflection, wasn't just grinning now. It was moving. Its hand reached up, slowly, and pressed against the glass. I felt it, too. The chill, the weight of something pushing against the thin barrier between us. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my pulse pounding. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was alive, and it wanted something. I knew then. It wasn't just a vision anymore. It was coming for me. And I didn't know how much longer I could hide from it. I couldn't move. My feet felt frozen to the ground as I stared at the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't just a shadow of myself anymore. It was a separate entity, a twisted version of who I was, mirroring my every movement but with a darkness in its eyes that I couldn't ignore. It was mocking me, its fingers slowly tracing the glass as if it knew how much terror I felt. A chill ran through me as I took another step back. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. The reflection, my reflection, leaned closer to the glass, its face now almost pressed against it. I could see the cracks forming on its skin, as though it was struggling to break free, as if the mirror itself was holding it captive. And yet, its eyes, those cold, soulless eyes, never left mine. I turned away, desperate to escape the growing terror. But even as I backed away from the mirror, I could still feel the pull, the weight of its gaze on me. The glass seemed to hum with an eerie energy, vibrating ever so slightly, as if it was alive, as if it wanted something from me. My mind raced with thoughts, none of them offering any real comfort. This can't be happening. I kept repeating to myself. It's just a trick. A mental breakdown. I'll get help. I'll get away. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't run from it. I couldn't escape something that wasn't confined to just one mirror. It was following me. The next few days were a blur of dread and confusion. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just stress, just the pressure of everything falling apart. But the mirrors were everywhere. In every reflective surface I passed, I saw it, that thing, waiting for me. It was no longer just my bathroom mirror. It was the reflection in windows, puddles, even the glass of my smartphone screen. And with each passing day, the reflection seemed to grow stronger, bolder. It began to move without my consent, its movements no longer synchronized with mine. It twisted in unnatural ways, as though the boundaries between the two of us were becoming blurred. I couldn't trust my eyes anymore. I called in sick to work. I couldn't bring myself to face people, knowing that the moment I stepped into a room with reflective surfaces, my reflection would be there, watching me. I had become a prisoner in my own home, avoiding mirrors, turning away from anything that might reveal what lurked within them. But the fear, the gnawing uncertainty, never left me. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, in the corners of my mind. I tried to take control. I set out to find answers, to understand what was happening to me and to everyone else. I began researching everything I could find about mirrors, reflections, and strange phenomena. Late nights were spent combing through online forums, reading obscure articles, and even trying to contact people who had experienced similar things. I found stories, fragments of others who had witnessed the same horror. One thread stood out to me. It was buried deep in a forum dedicated to paranormal occurrences, written by a user who claimed to know about the mirror curse. The message was short, but it sent a shiver through me when I read it. Once the reflection starts moving, you have only a short time. It won't stop until it's you. That was it. Just a cryptic warning, but something about it rang true. I had to face it. I had to confront my reflection. If I didn't, I would lose myself to it forever. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I gathered the courage to face the mirror again. It was time to end this. I would stand in front of it, look directly into my own eyes, and force it to show me the truth. The bathroom was quiet, too quiet, as I stood before the mirror. I could feel the air around me grow cold, the temperature dropping as if the room was being pulled into some dark void. I took a deep breath. I looked at myself. At first, everything seemed normal. But as I stared longer, I felt a shift. The air around me grew dense, and I could see my reflection shift ever so slightly. Its lips curled into that grin again, the same twisted expression that had haunted me. It was smiling. I blinked. My reflection's eyes, those cold, dark eyes, met mine with an unsettling intensity. And then, it moved. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It moved independently, stepping out of sync with my own body. It raised its hand, slowly, in a mocking imitation of my own movement. My breath caught in my throat. No. It was real. This thing was real. The reflection's smile widened. Its face began to distort, the skin peeling away as if it were melting, revealing something darker beneath. Something monstrous. It reached out for me, its fingers pressing against the glass, not just on the surface, but sinking into it, as if the glass was becoming soft, pliable. Panic surged within me. This is it, I thought. It's taking me. I backed away from the mirror, stumbling, my heart racing in my chest. But it was too late. The reflection was moving toward me. The glass distorted, bending as if it were some kind of dark portal. I could hear the whisper now. A voice, soft and insidious, coming from the mirror, coming from the thing that had once been me. It's too late. You belong to us now. The mirror began to crack, the sound sharp and hollow, like glass breaking under pressure. A low growl rumbled from within it, and I realized with horror that the thing in the reflection wasn't just a copy of me. It was something else. Something that had taken my place. I turned and ran. But no matter how fast I ran, the mirror's voice echoed in my mind, pulling me back, dragging me into the darkness. I had failed. There was no escaping. Not anymore. The mirrors had claimed me. And now, I was just a reflection. I could feel it now. A presence, pulling me deeper into the web of shadows. I was running, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through thick mud. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. Every reflection I passed, every shiny surface, held the thing that once was me. It wasn't just my face that stared back at me anymore. It was the other face, the one twisted in that permanent, mocking grin. The eyes that no longer belonged to me. The thing that had replaced me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized I couldn't keep running. No matter how far I went, it was always right there, in the glass, staring back at me. I made my way into the kitchen, a sudden chill creeping up my spine as I reached for the knife drawer. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the largest knife I could find. The cold metal pressed against my palm, but it gave me no comfort. The knife felt insignificant. I was no longer fighting to survive. I was fighting for my identity, for what little of me remained. The whispers grew louder. The mirrors were talking to me now, speaking in a chorus of faint, hollow voices. My mind raced as I tried to understand what was happening, but the logic was slipping through my fingers like water. Nothing made sense anymore. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the hallway. The bathroom mirror was still there. The one I had tried to avoid. The one that had nearly consumed me. I had to face it. Once and for all. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath me was sinking into darkness. The reflections around me, on windows, on glass surfaces, in the chrome fixtures, watched me, their cold, gleaming eyes following my every move. But none of them held the same terrifying power as the one in the bathroom. That mirror was the source of it all. The origin. The bathroom door creaked open as I stepped inside. The mirror stood before me, larger now, stretching from floor to ceiling. It was no longer just reflecting the room, it had become the room. I could feel my reflection there, moving in the glass, a twisted version of myself. I held the knife in front of me like a shield, but I knew it was useless. No weapon could save me from this. The reflection in the mirror was no longer imitating me. It was me. The real me, the one that had been pushed aside, locked away in the depths of the glass. And it was growing stronger by the moment. Its eyes locked with mine, and the smile, oh God, that smile, widened impossibly, stretching across its face like a grotesque parody. My own lips twisted in a helpless attempt to mimic it. I could feel the cold fingers of fear tightening around my throat, and the reflection knew. It knew what I was thinking. It knew how scared I was. "You're mine," it whispered, the voice coming from all around me, echoing in the corners of the room. "You'll never leave. You'll never escape." I dropped the knife, my hand going limp at my side. There was no fighting this. I was being drawn into the mirror, into the glass. I could feel it, the pull. The pressure against my skin, as if the mirror was reaching out, dragging me toward it, pulling me into its depths. With every passing second, I felt my identity slipping away. I was fading. The reflection was no longer a mere shadow. It was becoming me, replacing me in every way. My mind screamed for help, but the more I struggled, the more I faded. The glass began to ripple, as though it were alive. I reached out, instinctively, as if I could break the surface, as if I could shatter the reflection and stop it from consuming me. But the mirror bent and twisted, its edges curving around my fingers, pulling me deeper. And then, the reflection spoke again. "You're gone." The words were final. The darkness, thick and suffocating, swallowed me whole. I awoke, gasping for air, but the room was unfamiliar. I was lying on cold concrete, my body bruised, battered. There were no mirrors. No glass. Just darkness and silence. But then, I saw something. A faint glimmer in the distance. A soft, eerie glow. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head. A mirror. A large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall, its glass glimmering faintly, beckoning me closer. I could see myself in it. But it wasn't me anymore. It was the reflection. The one that had taken over. And it was smiling. The search for the missing. It was a quiet evening when I first arrived in the town of Langston, Kansas. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person alive in a place that hasn't seen much life for years. The sky was a dull gray, heavy clouds stretching across the horizon, and the wind carried a cold bite that seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. I was here for one reason only, to investigate the strange disappearances that had been plaguing the town. People had started vanishing without a trace, no signs of struggle, no clues left behind, just empty homes and confused families. The local police were baffled, and the case had grown cold. That's why a freelance investigator was called in. What was I expecting? A typical small-town mystery? A simple case of foul play? I quickly learned that I was in for much more than I had bargained for. The first night I spent in Langston was uneventful. A modest motel room, a bed that creaked under the slightest movement, and the sound of the wind howling outside. I tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as nerves, the weight of the case beginning to take its toll. But when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps outside my door, I knew something was wrong. I got up, heart racing, and pressed my ear to the door. There was no one there, just the wind again, pushing against the old building. But that sense of unease remained. As I lay back down, I wondered if I was beginning to unravel under the pressure, or if the town itself was trying to warn me. The next morning, I met with Sheriff Marlowe. He was a gruff man, his face lined with years of hard work and sleepless nights. He seemed tired, almost defeated, but his eyes were sharp. He led me to the town's small police station, where we would go over the details of the disappearances. "They're always the same," Sheriff Marlowe said, his voice low. "No signs of a struggle, no clues left behind. People just vanish. The first one was Sally Davenport 2 months ago. Then it was Alan Price, then the Thompson brothers. It's happening too quickly now. And the worst part is, we don't know why." I nodded, taking in the information. "Do you have any theories?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," he replied. "Some folks around here think it's just bad luck. Others, well, they've started to talk about something else. Something that's been here for longer than we can understand." I asked him to elaborate, but he was reluctant. He spoke in riddles about old stories and forgotten legends that had never made sense to the people of Langston. I didn't have time for folklore, I needed facts. Marlowe handed me a thick file. "Here, look through this. It's everything we've got on the disappearances. Maybe you'll find something we missed." I spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the case files, trying to connect the dots. But the more I read, the more my frustration grew. There was nothing tangible, nothing that stood out. Just a collection of missing persons reports and empty homes. As dusk fell, I decided to head out and speak to some of the locals. I needed to get a feel for the town, to understand the atmosphere. Langston was small, just a few streets and scattered houses, but it had a history. And history, I thought, might be the key to solving this mystery. I walked to the local diner, where a few people sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. They looked up as I entered, but none of them spoke. The silence was thick, oppressive. I made my way to a booth in the corner, and an older man named Earl approached me. He had a slow, deliberate way of moving, as if he had all the time in the world to tell his story, or none at all. "You're here about the disappearances, I suppose," he said, sitting down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "That's right. Have you heard anything about them?" Earl leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some folks say it's the spirits. Others say it's something worse. Something that's been down there for years." He motioned toward the ground, his eyes darting nervously. "You should be careful. Some things are better left alone." I couldn't help but feel that his words held more weight than he was letting on. There was a fear in his eyes, real fear, that made my skin crawl. "Something's down there?" I asked, trying to hide the growing unease in my voice. Earl didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the diner, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, he leaned in even closer. "Underground," he whispered. "In the tunnels beneath the town. You hear noises sometimes. Scratching. Scraping. Footsteps. But nobody goes down there anymore. You don't want to." He stood up abruptly, as if realizing he had said too much. "Stay safe, mister. That's all I'm gonna say." I sat there, stunned, as Earl shuffled away. His words echoed in my mind. "Something's down there." I had no idea what he meant, but something told me that it was connected to the disappearances. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had touched on something. Something dark and hidden beneath Langston. And I was about to find out just how deep that darkness went. The next morning, I went back to the sheriff's office. I needed to know more about these tunnels Earl had mentioned, and I was determined to find them. Sheriff Marlowe had already warned me about the stories surrounding the town, but now those stories felt more real, more dangerous. As I left the station, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the familiar sound, the faint scraping, like something or someone was scratching the ground beneath the streets. A chill ran down my spine. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. And soon, I would have to face it. The morning light filtered through the grim clouds, casting a dull glow over Langston. I couldn't shake the words Earl had whispered to me the previous night. Tunnels scratching. Footsteps. It all gnawed at my mind, pulling me towards something I couldn't yet understand. But I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to back down. I made my way back to Sheriff Marlowe's office. He was at his desk, staring at a pile of paperwork, his face etched with exhaustion. When I walked in, he barely looked up. "You find out anything useful?" he asked, his voice tinged with impatience. I slid the file I had gathered last night across his desk. I spoke to some of the locals. They keep talking about tunnels beneath the town. "Do you know anything about that?" Marlowe's eyes flickered with something, a flash of fear. He quickly wiped it away, but I saw it. "Tunnels," he repeated, his voice tight. "That's an old story. A legend, if you ask me. Never seen any proof of them. But I guess, maybe I should show you something." He stood and led me to a back room in the station. On the far wall, there was an old map, yellowed with age. It showed the town of Langston, but what caught my attention were the faint lines drawn underneath it. Tunnels. A network of them stretching beneath the streets, winding through the earth like veins. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice low with disbelief. "The town archives," Marlowe replied, his voice strained. I was skeptical too, but these tunnels, they go back a long way. Some say they were part of the original mining operations in the area, but no one remembers who built them or why they were abandoned. Do you think these tunnels have anything to do with the disappearances? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marlowe hesitated. I don't know, but I wouldn't go near them if I were you. The folks around here, they believe something is down there. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. I studied the map, tracing the lines of the tunnels with my finger. The farther I looked, the more unsettled I became. Some of the tunnels appeared to converge near the outskirts of town, near an old abandoned factory. The place had been out of business for as long as anyone could remember, and from what I knew, it was one of the first buildings in Langston to be built. I decided then and there that the factory would be my next stop. I thanked Marlowe and left the station, the cold air biting at my face. The town felt even emptier now, the streets devoid of people. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. The factory loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the gray sky. The building was tall, with broken windows and a rusting metal door hanging off its hinges. The closer I got, the more I felt it, something wrong in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a sense of dread washing over me. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, as though protesting my intrusion. The interior was dark, save for the thin streams of light that filtered in through the broken windows. The factory smelled of old oil and dust. There was a strange stillness here, as if the building had been abandoned for much longer than I had thought. I pulled my flashlight from my bag, its beam cutting through the darkness. The ground was littered with old debris, empty cans, broken tools, and pieces of wood that had rotted over time. I moved deeper into the factory, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty space. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched. Every step I took seemed to amplify the silence around me. The place felt alive in its own twisted way. My heart raced, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. And then, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. Like something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I forced myself to move forward, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. But the sound returned, this time louder, closer. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight toward the source of the noise. For a brief second, I thought I saw something in the shadows, something large, moving too quickly to be a human. My blood ran cold. Was it one of the missing people? Or something far worse? The sound continued, now unmistakably the sound of scraping claws against concrete. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A rat, perhaps? Or something larger? The scraping intensified, then suddenly stopped, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to move forward. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. The tunnel entrance. It was small, hidden behind a pile of rotting crates, but there it was, an old, rusted door that led underground. The same door from the map. The tunnels. I took a hesitant step forward, my mind racing with possibilities. Could this be where the disappearances were connected? Was whatever had been lurking here responsible for the missing townspeople? I had to find out. I couldn't turn back now. Before I could reach for the door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too heavy to be human, scraping across the floor behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but empty space. And then, I saw it. Two glowing eyes in the darkness, staring at me with a malevolent intensity. I froze. The creature, whatever it was, stepped forward, its massive body emerging from the shadows. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting the light from my flashlight, and the smell of decay filled the air. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished back into the darkness, leaving me alone in the factory with nothing but the terrifying sound of scraping claws. I stood there, motionless, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the image of its glowing eyes, those eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness and into my very soul, stayed with me. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was no illusion. Something in those eyes had been alive. The air around me felt heavier now, thick with tension. I turned back to the tunnel entrance, my feet moving despite my reluctance. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back. Whatever was down there, I needed to know the truth. My hand trembled as I reached for the rusted door, the sound of the old hinges squealing in protest as I pushed it open. The tunnel stretched out before me, a narrow, claustrophobic passage descending into the earth. The smell of dampness and decay filled the air, and I could hear the faintest sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the walls as I made my way deeper into the darkness. The further I walked, the more oppressive the silence became, as though the very earth was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed through the tunnel, and I tried to push aside the creeping sensation that I was being followed. Every few steps, I would hear something, a rustle, a scrape, a whisper, coming from the shadows. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, shifting and moving with an intelligence all its own. I spun around more than once, convinced I wasn't alone, but there was never anything there. Just the empty, endless tunnel. The walls of the tunnel were damp and uneven, the floor slick with a film of moisture. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The walls were scarred, as though something had scraped along them, leaving deep gouges in the stone. The marks were fresh, and the deeper I went, the more frequent they became. I felt a growing unease in my stomach. I had come here to uncover the truth, but the deeper I ventured, the more I began to question whether I should have left well enough alone. Something about this place, this tunnel, felt ancient, like it had been hiding secrets for far longer than the town had existed. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A low, guttural sound vibrating through the very ground beneath my feet. I froze, my blood running cold. It was the sound of something large, something powerful, moving through the tunnel. I wasn't alone anymore. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. My breath quickened, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, to turn around and escape, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I knew if I didn't face whatever was coming, it would be the end of me. I forced myself to move forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I pressed deeper into the darkness. And then, I saw it. The creature. It was massive, much larger than any rat or animal I had ever seen. Its body was a grotesque mass of twisted flesh, covered in matted fur that seemed to ripple as it moved. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes, shone like twin lanterns in the darkness, and I could feel their gaze piercing through me, weighing me down with a crushing sense of dread. The creature's claws scraped against the stone, sending a shiver of terror down my spine. It was only a few feet away now, its breath hot and rancid, its gaze unblinking. I could see the hunger in its eyes, the predatory instinct that drove it forward. I backed away slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. There was nowhere to run. No escape. The tunnel stretched on in both directions, a never-ending maze, and the creature was closing in on me. I thought I heard a sound, a voice, soft and distant, echoing through the tunnel. But it wasn't a human voice. It was something else, something ancient and full of malice. The voice was calling to me, urging me to stay. Stay. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The creature's claws scraped louder, closer, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble as it moved toward me. I had to act. I didn't know how much time I had, but I couldn't wait any longer. My fingers fumbled for the flashlight, but the beam flickered weakly, threatening to go out. I reached for my bag, grabbing the first thing I could find, an old flare I had brought just in case. Without thinking, I pulled the flare out and struck it, the sudden burst of light filling the tunnel with an eerie red glow. The creature recoiled, hissing, its eyes narrowing in the bright light. It backed away, but only for a moment. It was still there, still watching, still waiting. The flare sputtered in my hand, the light growing dimmer by the second. I didn't have much time. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the stone floor as I sprinted down the tunnel. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the creature's presence behind me, closing in, its breath hot against my neck. The sound of its claws scraping against the stone echoed in the narrow passage, growing louder and louder. I was almost at the entrance. Just a few more steps, and I would be free. But then I heard it, a loud crash, the sound of something massive colliding with the tunnel walls. I stumbled, my heart racing, as the ground beneath me trembled. I was so close to escaping. And then, the world went black. I awoke to an overwhelming darkness, thick and suffocating. My head was pounding, my body bruised and sore, as though I had been dragged through the dirt. My first instinct was to move, to stand, but my limbs felt like lead, and my vision was blurred. Slowly, I pushed myself upright, my hands scraping against cold, wet stone. The air around me was damp and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decay. I was still in the tunnel. The faint red glow of the flare was gone, replaced by a stifling, oppressive blackness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to orient myself, my mind racing to piece together what had just happened. How had I ended up here? I had been running, hadn't I? The creature had been right behind me. But now, nothing. No creature. No sounds of pursuit. Just the silence, deeper and more suffocating than before. I stood there for a long moment, listening intently. I couldn't hear anything at all, not the dripping of water, not the rustling of distant creatures, nothing. It was as if the tunnel had swallowed all sound, all life. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, my foot landing on something soft and yielding. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly recoiled, a chill creeping up my spine. My flashlight flickered back to life with a reluctant sputter, its beam casting weak light on the ground before me. It was a body. The body was sprawled unnaturally on the floor, twisted at an impossible angle. I could barely make out the features, but there was no mistaking the uniform, the faded coveralls of a worker. one of the missing. My stomach churned as I took a step closer. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, but something about the stillness, the unnatural way the body lay, set my nerves on edge. It was as if this person had simply dropped, their life drained out of them. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of what lay ahead was enough to freeze me in place. I had to keep moving. The deeper I went, the more I felt the pressure building, pressing down from all sides. The tunnel was alive with whispers now, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I could feel the weight of countless eyes on me, unseen, yet never truly gone. With a sharp intake of breath, I stepped over the body and pressed onward. The tunnel stretched endlessly before me, each step taking me further from the safety of the surface. But where else could I go? I couldn't leave. Not without knowing what was causing this. What was lurking down here in the depths. I moved cautiously, listening for any sounds, any signs of life. Then, suddenly, a soft scuttling sound broke the silence, distant but unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, every muscle tense. The noise grew louder, the faint scratching and scraping growing closer and closer, until it felt as though it was coming from all around me. I turned swiftly, my flashlight sweeping through the tunnel, but there was nothing. No creature, no shape, no movement. Just the empty darkness that seemed to swallow the light the moment it left the beam. But the feeling of being watched, that cold sensation crawling up my spine, only intensified. I couldn't shake it. Whatever was in these tunnels, it was closing in on me. I pressed forward, my breath shallow and quick. The tunnel twisted and turned in unpredictable directions, the walls narrowing in places, only to open up into vast, cavernous chambers that felt like they went on forever. The air grew more oppressive with every step. The walls were covered in those strange, dark gouges, deep, jagged marks that seemed to stretch on forever. And in some places, the floor was slick with something darker, something oily. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. A voice, but it was unlike any voice I had ever heard. It was a low, guttural hiss, and it sent a shiver through my bones. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the shadows, but again, there was nothing. No one. Just the endless, silent tunnel. My pulse quickened. I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight tighter, but my legs were growing weak, my steps becoming slower. The weight of the air seemed to be pushing down on me, the very walls of the tunnel closing in. I needed to find a way out. And then, I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, just beyond the faint glow of my light, something moved, something enormous. A shadow, shifting in and out of the beam. I froze again, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be a person, too dark to be anything natural. The eyes. Those terrible, glowing eyes. They were there again, staring at me from the darkness. And this time, there were more of them. Hundreds of them, all blinking in unison, their eerie glow cutting through the dark like tiny lanterns. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing with panic. The scuttling sound was back, louder now, closer, as if the very walls themselves were coming alive. I backed away slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but my foot hit something, a loose stone, a piece of rubble, and I stumbled, the noise of my fall echoing through the tunnel. The eyes blinked once, twice, and then they moved. A large, shadowy shape emerged from the darkness. It was the creature. The same one from before. But now, it was larger, more monstrous than I had ever imagined. It loomed in the tunnel, its massive form filling the space. Its body was like a grotesque mixture of rat and something worse, something that shouldn't exist. Its claws scraped against the walls, the noise sending a ripple of terror through my body. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice, an ancient, unearthly whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. Leave, or join, the others. The creature's voice lingered in the air like a foul stench, hanging over me with a weight that felt unbearable. My heart hammered in my chest, a deafening rhythm that drowned out all other sounds. I stood frozen, the light of my flashlight trembling in my hand, casting frantic, jittery beams over the creature's grotesque form. It took a slow step forward, the earth beneath me vibrating with each movement, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I wanted to scream, but my voice was locked within me, swallowed by the fear. Leave, the creature hissed again, its voice like 1,000 whispers merging into one. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls, as though the very rocks were alive with malice. I stumbled backward, my eyes never leaving those glowing, unnatural orbs. Its face, if you could call it that, was contorted in ways that no living thing should be. Its skin was slick and mottled, like the surface of something that had long since decayed. The smell, like rotten stale air, seeped into my senses, thick and suffocating. It was then that I realized the truth. The missing people, the strange disappearances, the workers who had gone silent, they weren't gone at all. They had become part of it. The creature, this thing, was feeding off the very essence of those it took. The eyes I had seen earlier, they belonged to the lost. Those poor souls trapped, their minds twisted into something that no longer resembled human thought. I could hear their voices now, faint but clear. They echoed from the darkness, from the very walls of the tunnel. Help us. The panic I had been suppressing erupted from deep within me. I wanted to save them, to save myself, but I knew there was no escape. The tunnel had become a prison. The creature's presence made that clear. It was everywhere now, its reach stretching far beyond the shadows, encroaching on every inch of space. Why? I gasped, my voice cracking with the weight of the question. Why are you doing this? The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. Its eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought I could see something almost human in its gaze. Then, the answer came, not in words, but in a sense that pulsed through the very air. It wasn't just feeding. It was growing. The tunnels were its domain, a place of eternal hunger, and it had been feeding on the souls of the lost for years, decades, perhaps. It needed them to feed its insatiable hunger, to grow stronger. It thrived in the dark, its influence spreading like a disease, turning the tunnels into a graveyard of twisted lives. I wanted to scream, to run, but the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no running. The tunnel was alive, and it was too late to escape. In that moment, the creature moved again, its enormous, clawed limbs reaching out with terrifying speed. I backed away, but the tunnel was too narrow. There was no room to flee. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its presence invading my mind, trying to pull me into its grasp. It was then that I saw them, faces, pale and twisted, emerging from the shadows. They were the workers. Their eyes were wide with terror, but there was no hope left in them. They were part of the creature now, their forms flickering in and out of the darkness like broken reflections in a cracked mirror. One of them, a man I recognized, reached out to me, his voice a hollow echo of the person he once was. "Join us, before it's too late." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight, but the whispers only grew louder. The sound of scuttling feet, the scraping of claws against the walls, the low growl of the creature, it was all closing in on me. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tunnel fell into an unnatural silence. The voices, the scuttling, the sounds of the creature, it all vanished. I opened my eyes, and there, standing before me, was a choice. An escape. The walls of the tunnel seemed to ripple, the darkness shifting like a living thing, and before me appeared a doorway, a sliver of light cutting through the black. It was a way out. But I knew the truth now. There was no escape from this place. No real freedom. I could walk through that doorway and leave, but what would become of me? Would I be free, or would I carry the terror of the tunnels with me, the weight of those lost souls pressing on my chest? The creature's presence, the whispers, the eyes, it would never leave me. I turned my back on the doorway. The creature roared, a deafening sound that shook the very ground beneath me. It was angry, furious. But I didn't care anymore. I had made my choice. I was going to stay. The darkness enveloped me, the walls closing in as the creature descended. The last thing I heard was the scraping of claws and the hollow voice of the man who had reached for me, calling out one last time, "Join us." And then, silence. Shadows of Los Angeles. Los Angeles had always been a city of endless possibilities, a place where dreams were made and broken. But recently, a new kind of darkness had begun to take hold. The city's bright lights couldn't chase away the creeping fear that seemed to be slowly suffocating its streets. Something had changed, something that no one could explain. I had been working as a journalist for the past 5 years, covering everything from celebrity scandals to political corruption. But lately, my stories had begun to focus on something far darker. There had been a string of brutal murders, each one more terrifying than the last. The police were stumped, and the press was running out of explanations. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence. Just bodies, discarded in dark alleys, their faces twisted in terror, their bodies drained of all life. I wasn't sure what to make of it all. A part of me thought it could be just another serial killer, maybe someone who knew how to cover their tracks better than the rest. But as I stood outside the latest crime scene, a small alley off of Sunset Boulevard, I felt something that I couldn't shake. A shiver ran down my spine, as if the very air around me had thickened, as if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. I tried to shake the feeling. There was a story to be written, and I had a job to do. But the night felt different. The usual hum of the city, the honking of car horns, the murmur of distant conversations was muted, replaced by an eerie silence that sent my heart racing. I turned toward the alley, where the police were still collecting evidence. My eyes scanned the area, looking for anything that might give me a clue. But all I saw were the familiar sights of the city, the graffiti-covered walls, the trash scattered on the ground, the flickering streetlight at the far end. And then, I saw it. At the corner of my vision, just beyond the reach of the light, a shadow moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadow flickered again, this time closer. And then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a faint rustling, almost like the wind brushing through leaves. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. The sound was too deliberate, too close. It was footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking through the alley, moving with a strange, unnatural grace. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. The alley was empty, save for the police and the flashing red and blue lights. But the sound persisted, coming from the darkness just beyond the reach of the streetlights. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run and never look back. But curiosity kept me rooted in place. What was it? Who was out there? I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, drawn toward the darkness despite every warning in my head. As I moved closer to the shadows, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air was colder here, and the sound of footsteps seemed to grow louder, more distinct. It was almost as if the figure was circling me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I turned back toward the police, thinking maybe I had missed something, some clue that could explain what was happening. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the alley was still empty. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I thought it had all been in my head. Maybe the stress of the case was getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. But then, something caught my eye. It was faint at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of the alley, but as I focused on it, I saw it clearly. A figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the light. Its outline was jagged, distorted, too sharp to be human. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at me from the shadows, its eyes gleaming like two pinpricks of light in the darkness. Then, without warning, it moved. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen, and it vanished into the night in a blink of an eye. I didn't wait to see where it had gone. I turned on my heel and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I tried to put as much distance between myself and the alley as possible. I had no idea what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. I couldn't stop shaking. The image of that figure, its eyes glowing in the darkness, stayed with me long after I left the alley. I had made it back to my apartment, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside made my heart race. The city felt different now, as if the shadows had grown longer, the night deeper. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone screen. I had to make sense of this. I needed to. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. What I had seen, what I thought I had seen, wasn't a person. It wasn't even something that could be explained away. My rational mind was grasping at straws, trying to tell me it was some trick of the light, a shadow, an illusion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I ran through the details again and again in my mind. The creature was tall, unnaturally tall. Its movements were too fast, too fluid, and the way it vanished into thin air was impossible to explain. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Hey, I saw a demon in the alley? They'd laugh me off the phone, or worse, send me to a therapist. No, I had to find answers myself. I had been covering the murders for weeks now, and each victim seemed to share one terrifying similarity: no one had seen the killer. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the way the bodies were found. They were different. Like something had drained them, emptied them, and yet there was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had actually happened. No blood, no marks. Just emptiness. I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door. I couldn't stay here, not with my mind racing like this. The city was still awake, alive with people, cars, lights. But to me, it felt as if there was a veil between the world I knew and something darker, something hiding in the spaces I couldn't see. The streets were quiet as I walked. The usual hum of the city seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. As I passed a few blocks from the alley, the feeling from earlier, like being watched, returned. My skin crawled, and I quickened my pace, not wanting to acknowledge the way my heart thudded in my chest. I reached the diner where I usually grabbed my late-night coffee. It was almost empty, save for a few people hunched over their meals, lost in their own worlds. I took a seat by the window, my eyes scanning the street outside. I tried to steady my breathing, focus on something other than the fear gnawing at me. The waitress came over, a tired smile on her face. "What can I get for you?" "Just coffee," I replied, trying to sound normal. She nodded and walked away, but before she could get far, a man stumbled into the diner. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide, wild, as if he had seen something unimaginable. I couldn't look away. He stumbled toward the counter, gasping for breath. "It's here," he muttered, his voice cracking. "It's in the tunnels, the shadows, they're everywhere." The waitress tried to calm him down, but his eyes were frantic, darting around the room as if he expected something to leap out from the corners. "Tunnels?" I whispered to myself. "The subway tunnels. Of course. The underground passages that ran beneath the city, a forgotten labyrinth where anything could hide. The idea of something lurking there, something that could move like that thing I had seen in the alley, it made my stomach churn. The man was still speaking in broken fragments. "I saw them. They were huge, eyes shining in the dark. They took them all." Before anyone could react, he darted out the door, running into the night as if something was chasing him. I didn't know what to think, but my instincts told me to follow. I paid for my coffee, leaving a tip that I didn't even bother to calculate, and hurried out of the diner. I didn't have a plan, but something in that man's eyes, his terror, spoke to me in a way words couldn't. Whatever was happening in this city, it was worse than I had imagined. I made my way toward the subway station, my feet carrying me without thinking. The streets were quieter now, the city's pulse slow, as if it too were trying to avoid whatever nightmare was crawling beneath its surface. The entrance to the subway was dark, the steps leading down into the abyss. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to take the first step. Then the next. And the next. The air was damp, stale, as I descended deeper into the tunnels. The sounds of the city above began to fade, replaced by the soft echo of my footsteps. And then I heard it. A rustling. I stopped, frozen in place. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to hear. It wasn't the sound of wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something was moving. A flicker of movement caught my eye, just beyond the light of the overhead bulbs. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone, the only source of light in this underground hell. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and shifting as if they had a life of their own. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at me from the darkness. The eyes, those glowing, unnaturally bright eyes, burned through the darkness. I froze, not daring to move, my breath caught in my throat. My phone's weak light barely pierced the inky blackness of the tunnel, but the eyes? They were clear. Too clear. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. All I could do was stare, transfixed by the way they reflected light, like tiny, hungry stars waiting in the shadows. Then, the rustling sound again. Closer this time. My heart thumped wildly, its beat loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of it pressing in, pushing me deeper into the tunnel. Focus, focus. I forced myself to take a step backward, my foot scraping against the rough concrete floor. The creature, or whatever it was, shifted. I didn't dare look away from those eyes, but I could feel its movement in the darkness, a sensation like a breath on my neck, cold and clammy. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, like bone cracking. I jumped, my chest tightening in panic. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with my phone, desperate to shed some light on whatever was stalking me. The phone screen flickered, then went out. In that brief moment of total darkness, I heard it. A sharp, guttural growl, low and menacing, echoing through the tunnels like the sound of something ancient, something that had been here long before I even stepped foot in this city. Get out. Get out now. I turned, running back toward the stairs, but the darkness seemed to shift, to twist around me. My feet felt heavy, my legs weak, as if the tunnel itself was pulling me back. I stumbled up the steps, my pulse pounding in my ears, but no matter how fast I moved, it was as though the darkness had clung to me, following me, waiting for me to slip. And then, bang! A loud thud came from behind me, so close I felt the vibration under my feet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I made it back onto the street, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just felt, what I had just experienced. The city was still quiet, too quiet. The night was heavy with a kind of stillness that didn't belong. The memories of those eyes haunted me, and I realized with a jolt that I wasn't alone. Turning around, I saw nothing. The street was empty, the shadows hanging in the streetlight like thick, black curtains. But I could feel it, something, just out of sight, waiting, watching. I had to find answers. I couldn't run from this. I had seen too much. I stumbled back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I threw myself onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. I closed my eyes, but all I saw were those eyes, bright, unblinking, in the dark. I had to figure out what was happening. But where could I even start? Who would believe me? What could I say? A knock on my door jolted me upright. My heart stopped, and for a split second, I thought I had imagined it. But then there was another knock, louder this time, insistent. I didn't move. Another knock. And then a voice, low and desperate. Please, let me in. They're coming. They're already here. I recognized the voice immediately. It was the man from the diner. With a hesitant hand, I slowly reached for the door, my mind racing. Who else could be out there? What did he know? I opened the door crack, just enough to peer out. His eyes were wide, wild, his face pale and covered in a thin sheen of sweat. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, as if he had been running through the streets all night. They're here, he muttered again, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw them in the tunnels. You can't escape them. They follow the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some crazed rant. Something about the way he spoke, the desperation in his eyes, it all felt too real. Come inside, I said, stepping back to let him in. As soon as he was through the door, he collapsed onto my couch, his breathing ragged. I locked the door behind him, my mind racing. What had he seen? What had he experienced? And why was he so certain that they were following him? "Tell me everything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes darted around the room, searching the corners as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Then, he began to speak, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It's the tunnels beneath the city. They've always been there, but no one talks about it. No one wants to know what's down there. The creatures, they're not rats. Not anymore. They've grown. They feed on fear. They've changed." I leaned forward, trying to grasp what he was saying. "Changed? What do you mean? Who are they?" He shuddered, wrapping his arms around himself as though trying to protect himself from something invisible. "You don't understand. They were just rats at first. But now there's something else. Something worse. They can take anything, anyone, and they leave nothing behind but shadows." His words sent a wave of dread through me. I couldn't process it. My mind couldn't make sense of this. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what he was describing was exactly what I had seen. The shadows. The glowing eyes. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, my thoughts spinning. "So what do we do? How do we stop them?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on something, somewhere beyond me, as if he could see them already, lurking in the dark. "You don't," he whispered. "You survive. You run, but there's nowhere to hide. Not from them." The fear in his eyes mirrored my own. And as I stood there, listening to him, I realized with a sinking feeling that he might be right. There was no escape from this. The hours stretched on in silence, the air thick with tension. I sat across from him, the man who had just revealed to me the unimaginable, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, more wrong than it had been. I kept glancing at the corners of the room, almost expecting to see glowing eyes peering back at me. It was a kind of paranoia, I suppose, born from what I'd seen and heard down in the tunnels. I couldn't get the sound of the creature's growl out of my head. The way it had echoed, vibrating through my bones, sinking into my very soul. But I had to focus. I had to know more. "What do you mean there's nowhere to hide?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've been down there. What exactly did you see?" He shifted on the couch, his eyes darting around as if he was looking for a way to explain something unspeakable. I didn't see them right away," he muttered. "At first, I thought it was just rats, like the stories. But then, when I went deeper into the tunnels, deeper than anyone is supposed to, I felt it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, his mind clearly reliving the horror. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but the fear that radiated from him kept me at arm's length. Whatever he had seen down there, it had shattered him in a way I couldn't fully understand. "The eyes," he continued, his voice cracking. "They weren't rat eyes. They were too big, too human in a way. And when they stared at me, I knew they could see me. Not just with their eyes, but with something else." I shuddered. I had felt it too. That suffocating, intrusive presence in the dark. It was like the tunnel itself had been alive, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. They can't be real," I muttered, more to myself than to him. I was trying to reason through it, to make sense of what we were dealing with. But why haven't they attacked everyone? Why just Why us? He shook his head slowly, the shadow of a defeated look crossing his face. It's not about us, he said, his eyes locked on mine with a fearful intensity. It's about what's down there. The tunnels, the city is built on them. And the deeper you go, the stronger they get. It's like they're drawn to fear. They feed on it, getting stronger the more terrified you are. That's why they're hunting us now. They know we're afraid. We've seen them. My stomach churned at the thought. I had been deep in those tunnels only hours ago, staring into the abyss, praying for a way out. But now, as I replayed every detail, it made a kind of twisted sense. The creatures weren't just some mindless animal. They were predators, hunting for more than just food. They fed on something more dangerous. Fear. The same fear that gripped me in that dark tunnel that made me run when I saw those eyes. The same fear that made my heart pound even now, as I sat in a dimly lit room with this man who, like me, had narrowly escaped. I needed to know more. I needed answers. Are you saying we're just supposed to hide? Run and hope they don't find us? I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. What do we do, then? How do we stop them? He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his own thoughts. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. We can't stop them. Not the way you're thinking, he replied, his voice raw. They aren't something you can fight. They're already here. They've always been here. But now, they're getting more aggressive. They're coming up. They're in the city, and it's only a matter of time before they spread. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought back to my time in the tunnels, to the growing sense of dread, to the oppressive darkness that had slowly encased me. If they were indeed spreading, then it was too late for any of us. Suddenly, I heard it. A soft scraping sound from the hallway outside my apartment. It was so faint, so distant, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate scratch, like claws against the floor. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes shot to the door. Do you hear that? I whispered urgently. The man's face paled even further. He nodded, the color draining from his cheeks. They found us, he said in a hoarse whisper. It's them. Before I could react, the scraping grew louder, closer. I could hear it moving now, along the wall, up and down, almost like it was testing the room, hunting for an opening. The air turned cold. The shadows around me thickened, crawling toward the corners of the room. I could feel the weight of the presence outside my door. Something was out there, waiting. What should I do? I thought, panic setting in. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. The scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It was moving away. But that didn't mean we were safe. They can't get in, the man muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself. They won't be able to get in. Not unless. Before he could finish, I heard it. A thump against the door, followed by a sharp, deep growl that rumbled through the walls, sending a wave of terror through my entire body. The creature was no longer testing the door. It was trying to break in. I stood frozen, unable to move as the door began to bend under the force of the thing outside. Run, he hissed. You can't stay here. They'll tear this place apart. We have to get out. It was the only choice. There was no way to fight. The only option left was to survive. With one last glance at the man, I turned and bolted for the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in that apartment. Not with them so close. As I pushed the window open, I glanced back one last time. The shadows in the room were shifting, crawling along the floor as though they had a mind of their own. I could hear the scraping sound again, louder now, coming closer. But I didn't have time to think. The city streets awaited. I had never felt such a rush of adrenaline before. The cold night air hit my face like a slap as I scrambled out of the window and onto the fire escape, my heart pounding in my chest. Below, the city seemed oblivious to the terror unfolding just a few floors above. The streets were alive with the usual hum of late-night activity, cars honking, people talking, the world continuing on as if nothing was wrong. But I knew better. I didn't know how long I had before they found me. I descended the fire escape as quickly as my legs would carry me, barely pausing to check the alleyway below. The sound of scraping continued to echo in my head, and the growl from inside the apartment still haunted my thoughts. The thing outside hadn't been alone. There was more than one. And they were coming. I reached the ground and ducked into the shadows of the alley. I could still hear it, the sound of claws dragging against concrete, slow and deliberate. The way it moved felt unnatural, like it was hunting, stalking its prey, anticipating the moment it would pounce. I didn't dare stop to look back. I couldn't afford to waste time. I just kept running, my feet slapping the pavement in a desperate rhythm. Each turn I made seemed to draw me further into the heart of the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only getting deeper into their territory. They were out there, following, always following. I reached the corner of the alley and froze. A figure was standing at the intersection, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. My blood ran cold, and every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I knew who this was. The man from earlier, the one who had warned me. He had followed me. He had known what was coming. But why? What did he want now? What are you doing here? I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. He stepped forward, his silhouette sharper now in the streetlights. There was something wrong with him. His eyes were wide, and his pupils were dilated, as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked broken. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost inaudible. "I couldn't let you go alone. You don't understand. They're everywhere. They're in the walls." His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw it, the raw terror in his eyes, the same fear that had overtaken me. I stepped back instinctively, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't been thinking clearly before. I had been running on instinct, but now I was starting to see it more clearly. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about something much darker. "We can't outrun them," he continued, his voice breaking under the weight of his words. "We can't hide from them. They will find us, no matter where we go. This city is their hunting ground. They know it like the back of their claws." I took a shaky step back, my heart racing. The alleyway felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if the darkness itself was pressing on us. I could feel the weight of something heavy in the air, something suffocating. "Then what do we do?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. "What do you want me to do?" They're coming. They'll find us. The man swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously toward the end of the alley. The sound of scratching had grown louder, closer. I could feel it too. They were near. You can't stay here, he muttered urgently. There's a place where they can't reach us. But we have to hurry. Without another word, he turned and started running, his steps quick and frantic. I hesitated for a moment, glancing behind me. The growls, the scratching, everything was closing in, drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't stand still. I had no choice but to follow him. I ran, the city passing by in a blur of lights and shadows. I had no idea where we were going, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Every corner I turned, every alley I sprinted down, felt like a maze leading nowhere. The fear, the pressure, it was like being suffocated by the very air around me. We reached a narrow street, darker and quieter than the others. The buildings here were older, abandoned. The man led me down an old staircase hidden beneath a rusted door into the depths of a building that looked long forgotten. As we descended into the building's basement, the air grew colder, heavier. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light, and the silence was suffocating. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. This is the place, the man said, almost in a whisper. They can't find us here. Not unless, his voice trailed off, and I knew what he was thinking. If we weren't careful, they could still hear us. But that wasn't the worst part. We'll be safe here, he insisted, but the doubt in his voice didn't reassure me. I could feel the weight of his words, the fear in his eyes. He had seen them, too. And now, in the silence of the basement, I felt it. They were close. Too close. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath us, and a faint, familiar scraping sound echoed from above. The sound was so close now, I could almost feel the creature's breath on my neck. My heart raced as I stared up at the ceiling, knowing what was coming. The shadows in the room twisted, and I could see something moving above us, creeping closer. The man's eyes widened in terror, but it was too late. There was no escape. The ceiling above us began to crack, and the first clawed hand reached through the gap. We were no longer safe. And as the room was consumed by darkness, I realized with horrifying clarity the creatures had been following us the entire time. There was nowhere left to run. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.